Chapter 1. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little, and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every female I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off. Then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising if they but knew it. Almost all men in their degree, some time or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean. There now is your insular city of the Manhattoes, belted round by wharves as Indian Isles, by coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it with her surf, right and left, the streets due waterward. Its extreme downtown is the Battery, where that noble mole is, washed by waves and cooled by breezes, which a few hours previous were out of sight of land. Look at the crowds of water gazers there circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Corlear's Hook to Coenties Slip, and a mystic by Whitehall northward. What do you see? Posted like silent sentinels all around the town, stand thousands upon thousands fixed in ocean reverie, some leaning against the spiles, some seated upon the pierheads, some looking over the bulwarks of ships from China, some high aloft in the ring, as if striving to get a still better seaward. But these are all landsmen, of weekdays pent up in lath and plaster, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks. How then is this? Are the green fields gone? What are they here? But look, here come more crowds, pacing straight for the water, and seemingly bound for a dive. Strange! Nothing will content them but the extremest limit of the land. Loitering under the shady lee of yonder warehouses will not suffice. No, they must get just as nigh to water as they possibly can without falling in. And there they stand, miles of them, leagues, inlanders all. They come from lanes and alleys, streets and avenues, north, east, south, and west. Yet here they all unite. Of why teachably I American each of those things certainly. We are a tiny when I worked in that number. Once more, say you are in the country, in some high land of lakes. Take almost any path you please, and 10 to 1, it carries you down in a dale, and leaves you there by a pool and a stream. There is magic in it. Let the most absent-minded of men be plunged in his deepest reverie stand. That man on his leg, set his feet a-going, and he will infallibly lead you to water, if water there in all that lead. Should you ever be athirst in the great American desert, try this experiment if your caravan happen to be supplied with a metaphysical professor. Yes, as everyone knows, meditation and water are weathered forever. But here is an artist. He desires to paint the dreamiest, shadiest, quietest, most enchanting bit of romantic landscape in all the valley of the Saco. What is the chief element he employs? There stand his trees, each with a hollow trunk, as if a hermit and a crucifix were within. And here sleeps his meadow, and there sleep his cattle. Continue, and up from yonder cottage goes a sleepy smoke. Deep into distant woodlands winds a mazy way, reaching to overlapping spurs of mountains bathed in their hillside blue. But though the picture lies thus tranced, and though this pine tree shakes down its sighs like leaves upon the shepherd's head, yet all were vain, unless the shepherd's eye were fixed upon the magic stream before him. Go visit the prairies in June, when for scores on scores of miles you wade meat among tigerlily. What is the one charm wanting? Water. There is not a drop of water there. or Niagara, but a cataract of sand. Would you travel your 1,000 miles to see it? Why did the poor poet upon suddenly deliberate whether to buy him, she sadly knew? Why is almost every robust, healthy boy with a robust, healthy soul in him at some time rather crazy to go to sea? Why upon your first voyage as a passenger did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deed, an own brother of Jove? Surely all this is not without me. And still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the torment in mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and ocean. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life. And this is the key to it all. Now, when I say that I am in the habit of going to sea whenever I begin to grow hazy about the eyes and begin to be overconscious of my lungs, I do not mean to have it inferred that I ever go to sea as a passenger. For to go as a passenger, you must needs have a purse, and a purse is but a rag unless you have something. Besides, passengers get seasick, quarrelsome, don't sleep o' nights, do not enjoy themselves. No, I never go as a passenger, nor, though I am something of a salt, do I ever go to sea as a commodore, or a captain, or a cook. I abandon the glory and distinction of such offices to those who like them. For my part, I abominate all honorable, respectable bills, trials. It is quite as much as I can do to take care of myself, without taking care of ships, barks, brigs, schooners, and whatnot. And as for going as cook, though I confess there is considerable glory in a cook being a sort of officer on shipboard, yet somehow I never fancied broiling fowls. Though once broiled, judiciously buttered, and judgmatically salted and peppered, there is no one who will speak more respectfully, not to say reverentially, of a broiled fowl than I will. It is out of the idolatrous dotings of the old Egyptians upon boiled ibis and roasted river horse that you see the mummies of those creatures, their huge bakehouses, the pyramid. No, when I go to sea, I go as a simple sailor, right before the mast, plumb down into the forecastle, aloft there to the royal masthead. True, they rather order me about some, and make me jump from spar to spar, like a grasshopper in a May meadow. And at first, this sort of thing is unpleasant enough. It touches one's sense of honor, particularly if you come of an old established, the Van Rensselaer, or Randolphs, or Hardicanute. And more than all, if just previous to putting your hand into the tar pot, you have been lording it, as a country schoolmaster, making the tallest boys stand in awe of you. The transition is a keen one, I assure you, from a schoolmaster to a sailor, and requires a strong decoction of Seneca and the Stoics to enable you to grin and bear it. But even this wears off in time. What of it? If some old hunks of a sea captain orders me to get a broom and sweep down the decks, what does that in the scales of New Testament? Do you think the Archangel Gabriel thinks anything the less of me, because I promptly and respectfully obey that old hunks in that particular instance? Who ain't a slave? Tell me that. Well then, however the old sea captains may order me about, however they may thump and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that it is all right. But everybody else is one way or other, served in much the same way, either in a physical or metaphysical point of view. And so the universal thump is passed round, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. Again, I always go to sea as a sailor, because they make a point of paying me for my trouble, whereas they never pay passengers a single penny that I ever heard of. On the contrary, passengers themselves must pay. And there is all the difference between paying. The act of paying is perhaps the most uncomfortable infliction that the two orchard thieves entailed upon us. But being paid, what will compare with it? The urbane activity with which a man receives money is really marvelous, considering that we so earnestly believe money to be the root of all earthly ills, and that on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven. Ah, how cheerfully we consign ourselves to perdition. Finally, I always go to sea as a sailor, because of the wholesome exercise and pure air of the forecastle deck. For as in this world, headwinds are far more prevalent than winds from the stern. That is, if you never violate the Pythagorean maxim. So for the most part, the Commodore on the quarterdeck gets his atmosphere at second hand from the sailors on the forecastle. He thinks he breathes at first, but not so. In much the same way do the commonalty lead their leaders in other things, at the same time that the leaders little suspected. But wherefore it was that after having smelt the sea as a merchant sailor, I should now take it into my head to go on a whaling. This is the invisible police officer of the fates, who has the constant surveillance of and secretly dogs me and influences me in some unaccountable. He can better answer than anyone else. And doubtless, my going on this whaling voyage formed part of the grand program of Providence that was drawn up a long time ago. It came in as a sort of brief interlude and solo between more extensive performances. I take it that this part of the bill must have run something like this: grand contested election for the presidency of the United States. Whaling voyage by one Ishmael. Bloody battle and a factistan. Though I cannot tell why it was exactly that those stage managers, the Fates, put me down for this shabby part of a whaling, when others were set down for magnificent parts in high tragedy, and short and easy parts in genteel comedy, and jolly parts in farces. Though I cannot tell why this was exactly. Yet, now that I recall all the circumstances, I think I can see a little into the springs and motives which, being cunningly presented to me under various disguises, induced me to set about performing the part I did, besides cajoling me into the delusion that it was a choice resulting from my own unbiased and discriminating judgment. Chief among these motives was the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. Such a portentous and mysterious monster roused all my curiosity in the wild and distant seas, where he rolled his island bulk, the undeliverable, nameless perils of the whale. These, with all the attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds, helped to sway me. With other men, perhaps, such things would not have been inducements. But as for me, I am tormented with an everlasting ache for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror and could still be social with it. Would they let me, since it is, but, well, to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place one lodges in. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome. The great floodgates of the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me, two and two there floated into my inmost soul, endless processions of the whale, and mid most of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. Chapter 2. I stuffed a shirt or two into my old carpet bag, tucked it under my arm, and started for Cape Horn and the Pacific. Quitting the good city of Old Manhattan, I duly arrived in New Bedford. It was a Saturday night in December. Much was I disappointed upon learning that the little packet for Nantucket had already sailed, and that no way of reaching that place would offer till the following Monday. As most young candidates for the pains and penalty of whaling stop at this same New Bedford, thence to embark on their voyage, it may as well be related that I, for one, had no idea of, for my mind was made up to sail in no other than the Nantucket craft, because there was a fine boisterous something about everything connected with that famous old island, which amazingly pleased me. Besides, though, New Bedford has been gradually monopolizing the business of whaling, and though in this matter, poor old Nantucket is now much behind her, yet Nantucket was her great original, the tire of this Carthage. The place where the first dead American whale was stranded. Where else, from Nantucket, did those aboriginal whalemen, the red men, first sally out in canoes to give chase to the Leviathan? And where, but from Nantucket too, did that first adventurous little put forth, partly laden with imported cobblestones? So goes the story to throw at the whales, in order to discover when they were nigh enough to risk a harpoon from the bowsprit. Now, having a night, a day, and still another night following before me in New Bedford, ere I could embark for my destined port, in a matter of concernment where I was. It was a very dubious-looking, nay, a very dark and dismal night, bitingly cold and cheerless. I knew no one in the place. With anxious grapnels, I had sounded my pocket and only brought up a few pieces of silver. So, wherever you go, Ishmael, said I to myself, as I stood in the middle of a dreary street shouldering my bag, and comparing the gloom towards the north with the darkness towards the south. Wherever in your wisdom you may conclude to lodge for the night, be sure to inquire the price, and don't be too particular. With halting steps, I paced the streets, and passed the sign of the crossed harpoon, but it looked too expensive in the jolly there. Further on, from the bright red windows of the Swordfish Inn, there came such fervent ring, but it seemed to have melted the packed snow and ice from before the house, for everywhere else the congealed frost lay 10 inches thick in a hard asphalted pavement, rather weary for me. When I struck my foot against the flinty projection, because from hard remorseless service, the soles of my boots were in a most miserable plight. Too expensive and jolly, again thought I, pausing one moment to watch the broad glare in the street and hear the sounds of the tinkling glasses within. But go on, Ishmael, said I at last. And don't you hear that? Get away from before the door. Your patched boots are stopping the way. So on I went. But I now by instinct followed the streets that took me waterward, for there, doubtless, were the cheapest, if not the cheeriest inns. Such dreary streets, blocks of blackness, not houses, on either hand. From there, a candle moving about in it. At this hour of the night, of the last day of the week, that quarter of the town proved all but deserted. But presently, I came to a smoky light, proceeding from a low, wide building, the door of which stood invitingly open. It had a careless look, as if it were meant for the uses of the public. So, entering, the first thing I did was to stumble over an ash box in the porch. Ha! Thought I. Ha! As the flying particles almost choked me. Are these ashes from that destroyed city, Gomorrah? But the crossed harpoons and the swordfish. This, then, must needs be sign of the trap. However, I picked myself up, and hearing a loud voice within, pushed on and opened a second interior door. It seemed the great black parliament sitting in Tophet. 100 black faces turned round in their rows to peer. Beyond, Black Angel was beating a book in a pulpit. It was a Negro church, and the preacher's text was about the blackness of darkness, and the weeping and wailing and teeth gnashing there. How, Ishmael, muttered I, backing out, wretched into the sign of the trap. Moving on, I at last came to a dim sort of light not far from the docks, and heard a forlorn creaking in the air, and looking up, saw a swinging sign over the door with a white painting upon it, faintly representing a tall straight jet of misty spray, and these words underneath: The Spouter Inn, Peter Coffin. Spouter, rather ominous in that particular connection, thought I. But it is a common name in Nantucket, they say. And I suppose this Peter here is an emigrant from there. As the light looked so dim, and the place for the time looked quiet enough, and the dilapidated little wooden house itself looked as if it might have been carted here from the ruins of some burnt district, and as the swinging sign had a poverty-stricken sort of creak to it, I thought that here was the very spot for cheap lodging and the best of pea coffee. It was a queer sort of place, a gable-ended old house, one side pole-seed, as it were, and leaning over sadly. It stood on a sharp weak corner, where that tempestuous wind Euroclydon kept up a worse howling than ever it did about poor Paul's tossed craft. Euroclydon, nevertheless, is a mighty pleasant zephyr to any one indoors, with his feet on the hob, quietly toasting for bed. In judging of that tempestuous wind called Euroclydon, says an old writer, whose works I possess only copy extant, it maketh a marvelous difference whether thou lookest out at it from a glass window where the frost is all on the outside, or whether thou observest it from that sashless window where the frost is on both sides, and of which the white death is the only brazier. True enough, thought I, as this passage occurred to my mind. Old black letter, thou reasonest well. Yes, these eyes are windows, and this body of mine is the house. What a pity they didn't stop up the chinks and the crannies, though, and thrust in a little lint here and there. But it's too late to make any improvements. Now, the universe is finished, the copestone is on, and the chips were carted off 1,000,000 years ago. His poor Lazarus there, chattering his teeth against a curbstone for his pillow, and shaking off his tatters, shivering. He might plug up both ears with rags and put a corn cob to his mouth. And yet, that would not keep out the tempestuous Euroclydon, says old Dives, his red silken wrapper. He had a redder one afterwards. What a fine, frosty night. How Orion glitters. What northern lights? Let them talk of their oriental summer climes, of everlasting conservatories. Give me the privilege of making my own summer with my own coals. But what thinks Lazarus? Can he warm his blue hands by holding them up to the grand northern lights? Would not Lazarus rather be in Sumatra than he? Would he not far rather lay him down lengthwise along the line of the go down to the fiery pit itself, in order to keep out this frost? Now, that Lazarus should lie stranded there on the curbstone before the door of Dives, this is more wonderful than that an iceberg should be moored to one of the Moluccas. Yet, Dives himself, he too lives like a czar in an ice palace, made of frozen sighs, and being a president of a temperance society, he only drinks the tepid tears of orphans. But no more of this blubbering now. We are going a whaling, and there is plenty of that yet to come. Let us scrape the ice from our frosted feet and see what sort of a place this spouter may be. Chapter 3. Entering that gable-ended spouter inn, you found yourself in a wide, low, straggling entry with old-fashioned wainscots reminding one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft. On one side hung a very large oil painting, so thoroughly besmoked, and every way defaced, that in the unequal proselytes by which you viewed it was only by diligent study and a series of systematic visits to it, and careful inquiry of the neighbors, that you could anyway arrive at an understanding of its purpose. Such unaccountable masses of shades and shadows that at first you almost thought some ambitious young artist in the time of the New England hags had endeavored to delineate chaos, but by dint of much and earnest contemplation and often repeated pondering, and especially by throwing open the little window towards the back of the inn, you at last come to the conclusion that such an idea, however wild, might not be altogether unwarranted. But what most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the center of the picture, over 3 blue and perpendicular lines floating in it. A boggy, soggy, squitchy picture truly, enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet was there a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you till you involuntarily took an oath to find out what that marvelous painting meant. Ever and anon, a bright but, alas, deceptive idea would dart you through. It's the Black Sea in a midnight gale. It's the unnatural combat of the four primal elements. It's a blasted haze. It's a Hyperborean winter sea. It's the breaking up of the icebound stream. But at last all these fancies yielded to that one portentous something in the picture's midst that once found out when all the rest were plain. But stop. Does it not bear a faint resemblance to a gigantic fish? Even the great Leviathan himself. In fact, the artist's design seemed this, a final theory of my own, partly based upon the aggregated opinions of many aged persons with whom I conversed upon the subject. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane. The half-foundered ship, weltering made to the attention, with its 3 dismantled masts alone visible, and an exasperated whale purposing to spring clean over the craft, is in the enormous act of impaling himself upon the 3. The opposite wall of this entry was hung all over with a heathenish array of monstrous clubs and spears. Some were thickly set with glittering teeth resembling ivory saws. Others were tufted with knots of hue, and one was sickle-shaped, with a bast handle sweeping round, like the segment made in the mean-mown grass by a long arm. You shuddered as you gazed, and wondered what monstrous cannibal and savage could ever have gone a death harvesting with such a hacking, horrifying implement. Mixed with these were rusty old whaling lances and harpoons all broken and formed. Some were storied weapons, with this once long lance now wildly elbowed. 50 years ago did Ethan Swain kill 15 between the sunrise and the sunset. And that harpoon, so like a corkscrew now, was flung in Javan seas and run away with by a whale years afterwards, slain off the Blanco. The original iron entered Niba tail, and like a restless needle sojourning in the body of a man, traveled full 40 feet, and at last was found embedded, crossing this dusky and on through yon low-arched way, cut through what in old times must have been a great central chimney with fireplaces all around. You enter the public room, a still duskier place art this, with such low, ponderous beams above, and such old, wrinkled planks beneath, that you would almost fancy you trod some old crafts cockpits, especially of such a howling night, when this corner anchored ark rocked so. On one side stood a long, low, shelf-like table, covered with cracked glass cases, filled with dusty rarities gathered from this wide world's remotest nooks. Projecting from the further angle of the room stands a dark-looking den, the ball a rude tent at a right whale's head. Be that how it may, there stands the vast arched bone of the whale's jaw, so wide a coach might almost drive beneath it. Within are shabby shelves, ranged round with old decanters, bottles, flasks. In those jaws of swift destruction, like another cursed Jonah, by which name indeed they called him, bustles a little withered old man who, for their money, dearly sells the sailors' deliriums and death. Abominable are the tumblers into which he pours his poison. Though true cylinders, within, the villainous green goggling glasses, deceitfully tapered downwards to a cheating bottom. Parallel meridians rudely pecked into the glass surround these footpads goblets. Filled to this mark, in your charge is but a penny more, and so on, to the full glass, the Cape Horn measure, which you may gulp down for a shilling. Upon entering the place, I found a number of young seamen gathered about a table, examining, by a dim light diverse specimen of scrimship. I sought the landlord, and telling him I desired to be accommodated with a room, received for answer that his house was full, not a bed unoccupied, but a vast, he added, tapping his forehead. You haven't no objections to sharing a harpooner's blanket, have ye? I suppose you are going a-whaling, so you'd better get used to that sort of. I told him that I never liked to sleep two in a bed, that if I should ever do so, it would depend upon who the harpooner might be, and that if he, the landlord, really had no other place for me. And the harpooner was not decidedly objectionable. Why, rather than wander further about a strange town on so bitter a night, I would put up with the half of any decent man's blanket. I thought so. Take a seat. Supper. You want supper? Supper will be ready directly. I sat down from an old wooden settle, carved a battery, all over like a bench, on the battery. At one end, a ruminating tar was still further adorning it with his jackknife, stooping over and diligently working away at the space between his legs. He was trying his hand at a ship under full sail, but he didn't make much headway. I thought. At last, some 4 or 5 of us were summoned to our meal. It was cold as Iceland, no fire at all. The landlord said he couldn't afford it. Nothing but 2 taluk in a winding sheet. We were fain to button up our monkey jacket and hold to our lips cups of scalding tea with our half-frozen. But the fare was of the most substantial kind. Not only meat and potatoes, but dumplings. Good heavens. Dumplings for supper. One young fellow in a green box coat addressed himself to these in a most direful manner. My boy, said the landlord, you'll have the nightmare to a dead certain. Landlord, I whispered, that ain't the harpooneer, is it? Oh, said he, looking a sort of diabolically funny. The harpooneer is a dark-complexioned chap. He never eats doing the dumpling. He don't. He eats nothing but steaks, and he likes them rare. The devil he does, says I. Where's that harpooneer? Is he here? He'll be here afore long, was the answer. I could not help it, but I began to feel suspicious of this dark-complexioned harpooneer. At any rate, I made up my mind that if it so turned out that we should sleep together, he must undress and get into bed before I did. Supper over, the company went back to the barroom, when, knowing not what else to do with myself, I resolved to spend the rest of the day as a looker-on. Presently, a rioting noise was heard without. Starting up, the landlord cried, That's the Grampus's crew. I seed her reported in the offing this morning. A 3 years' voyage, and a full ship. Hurrah, boys! Now, we'll have the latest news from the... A tramping of sea boots was heard in the entry. The door was flung open, and rolled a wild set of men, enveloped in their shaggy watch coats, and with their heads muffled in woolen comforters, all bedorned and lagged, and their beards stiff with icicles. They seemed an eruption of bears from Labrador. They had just landed from their boat, and this was the first house they entered. No wonder, then, that they made a straight wake for the little bog. When the wrinkled little old Jonah, their officiating, Sue poured them out brimmers all round. One complained of a bad cold in his head, upon which Jonah mixed him a pitch-like potion of gin and molasses, which he swore was a sovereign cure for all colds and catarrhs whatsoever, never mind of how long standing, or whether caught off the coast of Labrador, or on the weather side of an ice island. The liquor soon mounted into their heads, as it generally does even with the Aratus toppers newly landed from sea, and they began capering about most obstreperously. I observed, however, that one of them held somewhat aloof, and though he seemed desirous not to spoil the hilarity of his shipmates by his own sober face, yet upon the whole he refrained from making as much noise as the rest. This man interested me at once, and since the sea gods had ordained that he should soon become my shipmate, though but a sleeping partner one, so far as this narrative is concerned, I will here venture upon a little description of him. He stood full 6 feet in height, with noble shoulders and a chest like a coffer. I have seldom seen such brawn in a man. His face was deeply brown and burnt, making his white dazzling, while in the deep shadows of his eyes floated some reminiscences that did not seem to give him much joy. His voice at once announced that he was a southerner, and from his fine stature, I thought he must be one of those tall mountaineers from the Alleghanian Ridge. When the revelry of his companions had mounted to its height, this man slipped away unobserved, and I saw no more of him till he became my comrade on the sea. In a few minutes, however, he was missed by his shipmates, and being, it seems, for some reason, a huge favorite with them, they raised a cry of Balkington, and darted out of the house in pursuit of him. It was now about 9 o'clock, and the room seeming almost supernaturally quiet. After these orgies, I began to congratulate myself upon a little plan that had occurred to me just previous to the entrance of the seaman. No man prefers to sleep two in a bed. In fact, you would a good deal rather not sleep with your own brother. I don't know how it is, but people like to be private when they are sleeping, and when it comes to sleeping with an unknown stranger in a strange town, and that stranger a harpooner, then your objections indefinitely multiply. Nor was there any earthly reason why I, as a sailor, should sleep two in a bed more than anybody else. For sailors, no more sleep two in a bed at sea than bachelor kings do ashore. To be sure, they all sleep together in one apartment, but you have your own hammock and cover yourself with your own blanket and sleep in your own skin. The more I pondered over this harpooner, the more I abominated the thought of sleeping with him. It was fair to presume that being a harpooner, his linen or woolen, as the case might be, would not be of the tidiest, certainly none of the finest. I began to twitch all over. Besides, it was getting late, and my decent harpooner ought to be home and going bedwards. Suppose now he should tumble in upon me at midnight. How could I tell from what vile hole he had been coming? Wham, Lord, I've changed my mind about that harpooner. I shan't sleep with him. I try the bench here. Just as you please. I'm sorry, I can't spare ye a tablecloth for a mattress, and it's a plague eye rough board here, feeling of the knots and notches. Go wait a bit, Skirmishander. I've got a carpenter's plane there in the bar. Wait, I say, and I'll make ye snug enough. So, saying he procured the plane, and with his old soak handkerchief first dusting the bench, vigorously set to planing away at my bed, the while grinning like an idiot. The shaving flew right and left, till at last the plain iron came bump against an indestructible knot. The landlord was near spraining his wrist, and I told him for heaven's sake to quit. The bed was soft enough to suit me, and I did not know how all the planning in the world could make eiderdown of a pine plank. So gathering up the shavings with another grin and throwing them into the great stove in the middle of the room, he went about his business and left me in a brown study. I now took the measure of the bench and found that it was a foot too short, but that could be mended with a chair. But it was a foot too narrow. The other bench was about 4 inches higher, so there was no yoking them. I then placed the first bench lengthwise along the only clear space against the wall, leaving a little interval between for my back to settle down in. But I soon found that there came such a draught of cold air over me from under the sill of the window that this plan would never do at all, especially as another current from the rickety door met the one from the window, and both together formed a series of small whirlwinds in the immediate vicinity of the spot where I had thought to stand. The devil fetch that harpooner, thought I, but stop. Couldn't I steal a march on him, bolt his door inside, and jump into his bed, not to be wakened by the most violent knocking? It seemed no bad idea, but upon second thoughts, I dismissed it. For who could tell but what the next morning, so soon as I popped out of the room, the harpooner might be standing in all ready to knock me down. Still, looking round me again, and seeing no possible chance of spending a sufferable night unless in some other person's bed, I began to think that after all, I might be cherishing unwarrantable prejudices against this unknown harpooner. Thinks I'll wait a while. He must be dropping in before long. I'll have a good look at him then, and perhaps we may become jolly good bedfellows after all. There's no telling. But though the other boy kept coming in by ones two and going to bed, yet no sign of my harpooner. Landlord, said I, what sort of the chap does he always keep such late hours? It was now hard upon 12 o'clock. The landlord chuckled again with a chuckle, and seemed to be mightily tickled at something beyond my comprehension. No, he answered. Generally, he's an early bird, early to bed, and early to rise. Yes, he's the bird what catches the word. But tonight he went out a-peddling, you see, and I don't see what on earth keeps him so late, unless, maybe, he can't sell his head. Can't sell his head. What sort of a bamboozingly story is this you're telling me? Getting into a towering rage. Do you pretend to say, landlord, that this harpooner is actually engaged this Saturday night, or rather Sunday morning, and peddling his head around this town? That's precisely it, said the landlord, and I told him he couldn't sell it here. The market's overstocked. With what? Shouted I. With heads to be sure. If there are too many heads in the world, I tell you what it is, landlord, said I quite calmly. You better stop spinning that yarn too. I'm not green. Maybe not taking out a stick and whittling a toothpick, but I rather guess you'll be done brown if that ear harpens you a slant. I'll break it for him, said I, now flying into a passion again at this unaccountable farrago of the lights. It's broke already, said he. Broke, said I. Broke, certain, and that's the very reason he can't sell it, I guess. Landlord said, I going up to him as cool as now. Hecla in a snowstorm. Landlord, stop whittling. You and I must understand one another, and that too, without delay. I come to your house and want a bed. You tell me you can only give me half a one. That the other half belongs to a certain harpooner. And about this harpooner, whom I have not yet seen, he persists in telling me the most mystifying and exasperating stories, tending to beget in me an uncomfortable feeling towards the man you designed for my bedfellow, a sort of connection, landlord, which is an intimate and confidential one in the highest degree. I now demand of you to speak out and tell me who and what this harpooner, and whether I shall be in all respects safe to spend the night with him. And in the first place, you will be so good as to unsay that story about selling his head, which is true, to be good evidence of his harking a stark man, and I've no idea of sleeping with a madman. And you, sir, landlord, you, sir, by trying to induce me to do so knowingly, would thereby render yourself liable to a criminal prosecution. Wall, said the landlord, fetching a long breath. That's a purty long sunning for a chap that rips a little now and then. But be easy, be easy. This here harpooner I've been telling you of has just arrived from the South Seas, where he bought up a lot of balmed New Zealand heads. Great curios, you know, and he's sold all on them, but one, and that one he's trying to sell tonight, because tomorrow's Sunday. And it would not do to be selling human heads about the streets when folks is going to church. He wanted to last Sunday, but I stopped him just as he was going out of the door, with 4 heads strung on a string, for all the air like a string of Indians. This account cleared up the otherwise unaccountable mystery, and showed that the landlord, after all, had had no idea of fooling me. But at the same time, what did I think of a harpooner who stayed out of a Saturday night, clean into the holy Sabbath, engaged in such a case as selling the heads of dead idolaters? Depend upon it, landlord, that harpooner is a dangerous man. He pace regular, was the rejoinder. But come, it's getting dreadful late. You had better be turning flutes. It's a nice bed. Sal and me slept in that air bed the night we were spliced. There's plenty of room for 2 to kick about in that bed. It's an almighty big bed. But why? Before we give it up, Sal used to put our Sam and little Johnny in the foot of it. But I got it dreaming and sprawling about one night, and somehow Sam got pitched on the floor and came near breaking our tur that Sal said it wouldn't do. Come along here, I'll give ye a glim in a jiffy. And so saying, he lighted a candle and held it towards me, offering to lead the way. But I stood irresolute. When looking at a clock in the corner, he exclaimed, "It's Sunday. You won't see that harpoon tonight. He's come to anchor somewhere. Come along then." "Do come. Won't ye come?" I considered the matter a moment, and then upstairs we went, and I was ushered into a small room, cold as a clam, and furnished, sure enough, with a prodigious bed, almost big enough for any 4 harpooneers to sleep with. "There," said the landlord, placing the candle on a crazy old sea chest that did double duty as a washstand and center table. "There, make yourself comfortable now, and good night to you." I turned round from eyeing the bed, but he had disappeared. folding back the counterpane. I stooped over the bed. Though none of the most elegant, it yet stood the scrutiny tolerably well. I then glanced around the room, and besides the bedstead and center table, could see no other furniture belonging to but a rude shelf, the four walls, and a papered fireboard representing a striking a whale, the things not properly belonging to the hammock lashed up and thrown upon the floor. Also, a large seaman's bag containing the harpoon, no doubt in lieu of a land trunk. Likewise, there was a parcel of outlandish bonefish hooks on the shelf over the fireplace, and a tall harpoon standing at the head of... What is this on the chest? I took it up and held it close to the light, and felt it, and smelt it, and tried every way possible to arrive at some satisfactory conclusion concerning it. I can compare it to nothing but a large doormat ornamented at the edges with little tin tags, something like these stained porcupine quills, round an Indian moccasin. There was a hole or slit in the middle of this mat, as you see the same in South American ponchos. But could it be possible that any sober harpooner would get into a doormat and parade the streets of any Christian town in that sort of guise? I put it on to try it, and it weighed me down like a hamper, being uncommonly shaggy and thick, and I felt a little damp, as though this mysterious harpooner had been wearing it of a rainy day. I went up in it to a bit of glass stuck against the wall, and I never saw such a sight in my life. I tore myself out of it in such a hurry that I gave myself a kink in the neck. I sat down on the side of the bed and commenced thinking about this head-pedaling harpooner and his doormat. After thinking some time on the bedside, I got up and took off my monkey jacket, and then stood in the middle of the room. I then took off my coat and thought a little more in my shirt sleeves, but beginning to feel very cold now, half undressed as I was, and remembering what the landlord said about the harpooneers not coming home at all that night. It being so very late, I made no more ado, but jumped out of my pantaloons and boots, then blowing out the light, tumbled into bed and commended myself to the care of heaven. Whether that mattress was stuffed with corn cobs or broken crockery, there is no telling, but I rolled about a good deal, and could not sleep for a long time. At last, I slid off into a light doze, and had pretty nearly made a good offing towards the land of Nod, when I heard a heavy footfall in the passage, and saw a glimmer of light come into from under the door. Lord, save me. Thinks I, that must be the harpooner, infernal head peddler. But I lay perfectly still, and resolved not to say a word, till spoken to. Holding a light in one hand, and that identical New Zealand head in the other, the stranger entered the room, and without looking toward the bed, placed his candle a good wail from me on the floor in one corner, and then began working away at the knotted cords of the large bag I before spoke of as being in the room. I was all eagerness to see his face, but he kept it averted for some time, while employed in unlacing the bag's mouth. This accomplished, however, he turned round, when, good heavens, what a sight! Such a face! It was of a dark, purplish yellow color, here and there, stuck over with large blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow. He's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and here he is, just from the surgeon. But at that moment, he chanced to turn his face so towards the light, that I plainly saw they could not be sticking plasters at all. Those black squares on his cheeks, they were stings of some sort or other. At first I knew not what to make of this, but soon an inkling of the truth occurred to me. I remembered a story of a white man, a whaleman too, who falling among the cannibals had been tattooed by them. I concluded that this harpooner, the course of his distant voyages, must have met with a similar adventure. And what is it, thought I, after all? It's only his outside. A man can be honest in any sort of skin. But then, what to make of his unearthly complexion? That part of it, I mean, lying roundabout and completely independent of the squares of tattooing. To be sure, that might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tan. But I never heard of a hot sun's tanning a white man into a purplish yellow one. However, I had never been in the South Seas, and perhaps the sun there produced these extraordinary effects upon the skin. Now, while all these ideas were passing through me like lightning, this harpooner never noticed me at all. But after some difficulty, having opened his bag, he commenced fumbling in it and presently pulled out a sort of tomahawk and a sealskin wallet with a hair on. Placing these on the old chest in the middle of the room, he then took the New Zealand head, a ghastly thing enough, and crammed it down into the bag. He now took off his hat, a new beaver hat, when I came nigh singing out with fresh surprise. There was no hair on his head, none, to speak of at least. Nothing but a small scalp knot twisted up on his forehead. His bold, purplish head now looked for all the world like a mildewed skull. Had not the stranger stood between the door, I would have bolted out of it quicker than ever. Even as it was, I thought something of slipping out of the window, but it was the second floor back. I am no coward, but what to make of this head-peddling purple rascal altogether past my comprehension. Ignorance is the parent of fear, and being completely nonplussed and confounded about the stranger, I confess I was now as much afraid of him as if it was the devil himself who had thus broken into my room at the dead of night. In fact, I was so afraid of him that I was not game enough just then to address him and demand a satisfactory concerning what seemed inexplicable in him. Meanwhile, he continued the business of undressing, and at last showed his chest and arms. As I live, these covered parts of him were checkered with the same squares as his face. His back, too, was all over the same dark squares. He seemed to have been in a 30 years' war, and just escaped from it, with a sticking plaster shirt. Still more, his very legs were marked, as if a parcel of dark green frogs were running up the trunks of young palms. It was now quite plain that he must be some abominable savage, or unshipable of a whaleman in the South Seas, and so landed in this Christian country. I quaked to think of it. A peddler of heads, too, perhaps the heads of his own brothers. He might take a fancy to mine. Heavens, look at that tomahawk. But there was no time for shuddering, for now the savage went about something that completely fascinated my attention and convinced me that he must indeed be a heathen. Going to his heavy grego, or rapple, or dreadnought, which he had previously hung on a chair, he fumbled in the pockets and produced at length a curious little deformed image with a hunch on its back, and exactly the color of a 3-days-old Congo baby, remembering the embalmed head. At first, I almost thought that this black mannequin was a real baby preserved in some similar, but seeing that it was not at all limber and that it glistened a good deal like polished ebony, I concluded that it must be nothing but a wooden idol, which indeed it proved to be. For now the savage goes up to the empty fireplace, and removing the papered fireboard, sets up this little hunchbacked image like a 10-pin between the andirons. The chimney jambs and all the bricks inside were very sooty, so that I thought this fireplace made a very appropriate little shrine or chapel for his Congo idol. I now screwed my eyes hard towards the half-hidden image, feeling but ill at ease meantime to see what was next to follow. First, he takes about a double handful of shavings out of his grego pocket and places them carefully before the idol. Then, laying a bit of ship biscuit on top and applying the flame from the lamp, he kindled the shavings into a sacrificial blaze. Presently, after many hasty snatches into the fire, and still hastier withdrawals of his finger, whereby he seemed to be scorching them badly, he at last succeeded in drawing out the bit. Then, blowing off the heat and ashes a little, he made a polite offer of it to the little neat. But the little devil did not seem to fancy such dry sort of fare at all. He never moved his lips. All these strange antics were accompanied by still stranger guttural noises from the devotee, who seemed to be praying in a sing-song, or else singing some pagan psalmody or other, during which his face twitched about in the most unnatural manner, At last, extinguishing the fire, he took the idol up very unceremoniously, and bagged it again in his grego pocket as carelessly as if he were a sportsman bagging a dead woodcock. All these queer proceedings increased my uncomfortableness, and seeing him now exhibiting strong symptoms of concluding his business operations and jumping into bed with me, I thought it was high time, now or never, before the light was put out, to break the spell in which I had so long been bound. But the interval I spent in deliberating what to say was a fatal one. Taking up his tomahawk from the table, he examined the head of it for an instant, and then holding it to the light. With his mouth at the handle, he puffed out great clouds of tobacco smoke. The next moment the light was extinguished, and this wild cannibal tomahawk sprang into bed with me. I sang out, I could not help it now, and giving a sudden grunt of astonishment, he began feeling me. Stammering out something, I knew not what, I rolled away from him against the wall and then conjured whoever, or whatever he might be, to keep quiet, and let me get up and light the lamp again. But his guttural responses satisfied me at once, but ill comprehended. Who was her body missing? E.D. Bell, you. He at last said, "Your nose speaky, damn me, I kill him." And so, saying the lighted tomahawk, began flourishing about me in the dark. "Landlord, for God's sake, Peter Coffin," shouted I, landlord. Watch. Coffin. Angels, save me. Speaky, telling me who he be, or damn me, I kill ye. Again growled the cannibal, while his horrid flourishings of the tomahawk scattered the hot tobacco ashes about me, till I fought my linen on fire. But thank heaven, at that moment, the landlord came into the room, light in hand, and leaping from the bed I ran up to him. "Don't be afraid now," said he, grinning again. "Queequeg here wouldn't harm a hair of your head." "Stop your grinning," shouted I, "and why didn't you tell me that infernal harpooner was a cannibal?" I thought, he noted. "Didn't I tell you he was a peddling heads around town that turns looks again and go to sleep?" Queequeg, "Look here, you savvy me, I savvy you. Queequeg, this man sleep you savvy." "We savvy plenty," grunted Queequeg, puffing away at his pipe and sitting up in bed. "You giddy in," he added, motioning to me with his tomahawk and throwing the clothes to one side. He really did this in not only a civil, but a really kind and charitable way. I stood looking at him a moment. For all his tattooings, he was on the whole a clean, calmly looking. What's all this fuss I have been thinking about? Thought I to myself. The man's a human being, just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. "Landlord," said I, "tell him to stash his tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it. Tell him to stop smoking, in short, and I will turn in with him. But I don't fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I am insured." This being told to Queequeg, he at once complied, and again politely motioned to get into bed, rolling over to one side as much as to say, "I won't touch a leg of all. Good night, landlord," said I. "You may go." I turned in, and never slept better in my life. Chapter 4. Upon waking next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. The counterpane was of patchwork, full of odd little party-colored squares and triangles, and this arm of his tattooed all over with an interminable creeping labyrinth of a figure, no two parts of which were of one precise shade, owing, I suppose, to his keeping his arm at sea unmethodically, in sun and shade, his shirt sleeves irregularly rolled up at various times. This same arm of his, I say, looked for all the world like a strip of that same patchwork quilt. Indeed, partly lying on it, as the arm did when I first awoke, I could hardly tell it from the quilt. They so blended their hues together, and it was only by the sense of weight and pressure that I could tell that Queequeg was hugging me. My sensations were strange. Let me try to explain them. When I was a child, I well remember a somewhat similar circumstance that befell me. Whether it was a reality or a dream, I never could entirely settle. The circumstance was this. I had been cutting up some caper or other. I think it was trying to crawl up the chimney, as I had seen a little sweep, and my stepmother who, somehow or other, was all the time whipping me or sending me to bed supperless. My mother dragged me by the legs out of the chimney and packed me off to bed, though it was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 21st of the longest day in the year in our hemisphere. I felt dreadfully, but there was no help for it. So upstairs I went to my little room in the 3rd floor, undressed myself as slowly as possible and with a bitter sigh I lay there, dismally calculating that 16 entire hours must elapse before I could hope for a resurrection. 16 hours in bed. The small of my back ached to think of it. And it was so light too, the sun shining in at the window, and a great rattling of coaches in the streets, and the sound of gay voices all over the house. I felt worse and worse. At last, I got up, dressed, and softly going down in my stoking, sought out my stepmother, and suddenly threw myself at her feet, beseeching her as a particular favor to give me a good slipper for my misbehavior. Anything indeed, but condemning me to lie, abide such an unendurable length of time. But she was the best and most conscientious of stepmothers, and back I had to go to my room. For several hours I lay there, bottling, feeling a great deal worse than I had ever done since, even from the greatest subsequent misfortune. At last, I must have fallen into a troubled nightmare of a dozy, and slowly waking from it, half steeped in dream, I opened my eyes, and the before sunlit room was now wrapped in outer darkness, and instantly I felt a shock running through all my frame. Nothing was to be seen, and nothing was to be heard, but a supernatural hand seemed placed in mine. My arm hung over the counterpane, and the nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom to which the hand belonged seemed closely seated by my bedside. For what seemed ages piled on ages, I lay there frozen with the most awful, not daring to drag away my hand, yet ever thinking, but if I could but stir it 1 single inch, the horrid spell would be broken. I knew not how this consciousness at last glided away from me, but waking in the morning, I shudderingly remembered it all, and for days and weeks and months afterwards, I lost myself in confounding attempts to explain the mystery. Nay, to this very hour, I often puzzle myself with it. Now, take away the awful fear, and my sensations that feeling the supernatural hand in mine were very similar in their strangeness to those which I experienced on waking up and seeing Queequeg's pagan arm thrown round me. But at length, all the past night's events soberly recurred, one by one, in fixed reality, and then I lay only alive to the comical predicament. For though I tried to move his arm, unlock his bridegroom clasp, yet, sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, as though naught but death should part us twain. I now strove to rouse him, Queequeg, but his only answer was a snore. I then rolled over, my neck feeling as if it were in a horse collar, and suddenly felt a slight scratch. Throwing aside the counterpan, there lay the tomahawk sleeping by the savage's side, as if it were hatchet-faced baby. A pretty pickle, truly, thought I. Abed here in a strange house in the broad day, with a cannibal and a tomahawk. Queequeg, in the name of goodness, Queequeg, wake. At length, by dint of much wriggling, loud and incessant expostulations upon the unbecomingness of his hugging a fellow male in that matrimonial sort of style, I succeeded in extracting a groan, and presently he drew back his arm, shook himself all over land dog just from the water, and sat up in bed, stiff as a pikestaff, looking at me, and rubbing his eyes, as if he did not altogether remember how I came, though a dim consciousness of knowing something about me seemed slowly dawning. Meanwhile, I lay quietly eyeing him, having no serious misgivings, and bent upon narrowly observing so curious a creature, when at last his mind seemed made up touching the character of his bedfellow, and he became, as it were, reconciled to the fact. He jumped out upon the floor, and by certain signs and sounds gave me to understand that if it pleased me, he would dress first, and then leave me to dress afterward, leaving the whole apartment. Thinks I Queequeg, under the circumstances, this is a very civilized overture. But the truth is, these savages have an innate sense of delicacy. Say what you will, it is marvelous how essentially polite they are. I pay this particular compliment to Queequeg because he treated me with so much civility and consideration, while I was guilty of great rudeness. Staring at him from the bed, and watching all his toilet motions, for the time my curiosity getting the better of my breeding. Nevertheless, a man like Queequeg you don't see every day. He and his ways were well worth unusual regarding. He commenced dressing at top by donning his beaver hat, a very tall one, by the by, and then, still minus his trouser, he hunted up his boots. What under the heavens he did it for, I cannot tell, but his next movement was to crush himself, boots in hand, and hat on under the bed, when from sundry violent gaspings and strainings, and for he was hard at work, hooting himself, though by no law of propriety that I ever heard of, is any man required to be private when putting on his boots. But Queequeg, do you see, with a creature in the transition stage, neither caterpillar nor butterfly. He was just enough civilized to show off his outlandishness in the strangest possible manners. His education was not yet completed. He was an undergraduate. If he had not been a small degree civilized, he very probably would not have troubled himself with boots at all. But then, if he had not been still a savage, he never would have dreamt of getting under the bed to put them on. At last he emerged with his hat, very much dented, crushed down over his eyes, and began creaking and limping about the room, as if, not being much accustomed to boots, his pair of damp, wrinkled cowhide ones, probably not made to order either, rather pinched and tormented him at the first go off of a bitter cold morning, seeing now that there were no curtains to the window, and that the street being very narrow, the house opposite commanded a plain view into the room, and observing more and more the indecorous figure that Queequeg made, staving about with little else but his hat, I begged him as well as I could to accelerate his toilet somewhat, and particularly to get into his pantaloons as soon as possible. He complied, and then proceeded to wash himself. So at that time in the morning, any Christian would have washed his face. But Queequeg, to my amazement, contented himself with restricting his ablutions to his chest, arms, and hands. He then donned his waistcoat, and taking up a piece of hard soap on the washstand center table, dipped it into water, and commenced lathering his face. I was watching to see where he kept his razor, when lo and behold, he takes the harpoon from the bed corner, slips out the long wooden stalk, unsheaths the head, wets it a little on his, and striding up to the bit of mirror against, begins a vigorous scraping, or rather harpooning. Thinks I, Queequeg, this is using Roger's best coloring, with a vengeance. Afterwards I wondered the less at this operation when I came to know of what fine steel the head of a harpoon is made, and how exceedingly sharp the long straight edges are always kept. The rest of his toilet was soon achieved, and he proudly marched out of the room, wrapped up his great pilot-monkey jacket, and sporting his harpoon like a marshal's baton. Chapter 5. I quickly followed suit, and descending into the ballroom, accosted the grinning landlord very pleasantly. I cherished no malice towards him, though he had been skylarking not a little in the matter of my bedfellow. However, a good laugh is a mighty good thing, and rather too scarce a good thing. The more's the pity. So, if any one man, in his own proper person, affords stuff for a good joke to anybody, let him not be backward, but let him cheerfully allow himself to spend and be spent in that way. And the man that has anything bountifully laughable about him, be sure there's more in that man than you perhaps think for. The barroom was now full of the boarders who had been dropping in the previous, and whom I had not, as yet, had a good look at. They were nearly all whalemen, chief mates, and second mates, and third mates, and sea carpenters, and sea coopers, and sea blacksmiths, and harpooneers, and shipkeepers. A brown and brawny company, with bosky beards, an unshorn, shaggy set, all wearing monkey jackets for morning gown. You could pretty plainly tell how long each one had been ashore. This young fellow's healthy cheek was like a sun-toasted pear in hue, and would seem to smell almost as musky. He cannot have been 3 days landed from his Indian voyage. That man next him finds low, look a few shades lighter. You might say a touch of satin wood is in him. In the complexion of the third still lingers a tropic tawn, but slightly bleached withal. He, doubtless, has tarried whole weeks ashore. But who could show a cheek like Queequeg, which, barred with various tints, seemed like the Andes' western slope, to show forth in one array, contrasting climates, zone by zone, grub. Oh, now cried the landlord, flinging open the door, and in we went to breakfast. They say that men who have seen the world thereby become quite at ease in manner, quite self-possessed in company. Not always, though. Ledyard, the great New England traveler, and Mungo Park, the Scotch one, of all men, they possessed the least assurance in the parlor. But perhaps the mere crossing of Siberia in a sledge drawn by dogs, as Ledyard did, or the taking a long, solitary walk to stomach in the Negro heart of Africa, which was the sum of poor Mungo's. This kind of travel, I say, may not be the very best mode of attaining a high social point. Still, for the most part, that sort of thing is to be had anywhere. These reflections, just here, are occasioned by the circumstance that after we were all seated at the table, and I was preparing to hear some good stories about whaling, to my no small surprise, nearly every man a profound silence. And not only that, but they looked embarrassed. Yes, here were a set of sea dogs, many of whom, without the slightest bashfulness, had boarded great whales on the high seas, entire strangers to them, and dueled them dead, without winking. And yet, here they sat, at a social breakfast table, all of the same calling, all of kin, looking round as sheepishly at each other, as though they had never been out of sight of some sheepfold among the Green Mountains. A curious sight, these bashful bears, these timid warrior whalemen. But as for Queequeg, why, Queequeg sat there among them, at the head of the table too. It so chanced, as cool as an icicle. To be sure, I could not say much for his breeding. His greatest admirer could not have cordially justified his bringing his harpoon into breakfast with him, and using it there without ceremony, reaching over the table with it, to the imminent jeopardy of many heads, and grappling the beefsteaks towards him. But that was certainly very coolly done by him, and everyone knows that in most people's estimation, to do anything coolly is to do it genteelly. We will not speak of old Queequeg's peculiarities here, how he eschewed coffee and hot rolls, and applied his undivided attention to beefsteaks, then rare. Enough that when breakfast was over, withdrew, like the rest, to the public, lighted his tomahawk pipe, and was sitting there quietly digesting and smoking with his inseparable hat on when I sallied out for a stroll. Chapter 6. If I had been astonished at first catching a glimpse of so outlandish an ending as Queequeg, circulating among the polite society of a civilized, that astonishment soon departed upon taking my first daylight stroll through the streets of New Bedford. In thoroughfares nigh the docks, any considerable seaport will frequently offer to view the queerest looking nondescripts from foreign parts. Even on Broadway and Chestnut streets, Mediterranean mariners will sometimes jostle the affrighted ladies. Regent Street is not unknown to Lascars and Malays, And at Bombay, in the Apollo Green, live Yankee have often scared the natives. But New Bedford beats all Water Street and Wapping. In these last mentioned haunts, you see only sailors, but in New Bedford, actual cannibals stand chatting at street corners. Savages outright, many of whom yet carry on their bones unholy flesh. It makes a stranger stare. But besides the Fijians, Tonga-Tobors, Aromangoans, Penangians, and Breezegians, and, as the wild specimens of the whaling craft, which unheeded reel about the straits, there weekly arrive in this town scores of green Vermonters and New Hampshire men, all athirsts for game fishing. They are mostly young of stalwart frames, fellows who have felled forests, and now seek to drop the axe and snatch the whale lamp. Many are as green as the Green Mountains whence they came. In some things you'd think them but a few hours old. Look there, that chap's strutting round the corner. He wears a beaver hat and swallow-tailed coat, girdled with a sailor belt and sheath knife. Here comes another with a sou'wester and a bombazine cloak. No town-bred dandy will compare with a country-bred one. I mean, a downright drunken dandy. A fellow that, in the dog days, will mow his 2 acres in buckskin gloves for fear of tanning his hands. Now, when a country dandy like this takes it into his head to make a distinguished reputation and joins the great whale fishery, you should see the comical things he does upon reaching the seaport. In bespeaking his sea outfit, he orders bell buttons to his waistcoats, straps to his canvas trousers. Ah, poor hayseed. How bitterly will burst those straps in the first howling gale, when thou art driven, straps, buttons, and all, down the throat of the tempest. But think not that this famous town has only harpooneers, cannibals, and bumpkins to show her visitors. Not at all. Still, New Bedford is a queer place. Had it not been for us whalemen, that tract of land would this day, perhaps, have been in as howling condition the coast of Labrador. As it is, parts of her back country are enough to frighten them. They look so bony. The town itself is perhaps the dearest place to live in all New England. Where it is a land of oil, true enough, but not like Canaan. A land, also, of corn and wine. The streets do not run with milk. More in the springtime do they pave them with fresh eggs. Yet, in spite of this, nowhere in all America will you find more patrician-like houses, parks and gardens more opulent than in New Bedford. Whence came they? How planted upon this once scraggy scoria of a country? Go and gaze upon the iron emblematical harpoons round yonder lofty mansion, and your question will be answered. Yes, all these brave houses and flowery gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. One and all, they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. Can Harold Alexander perform a feat like that?
In New Bedford, fathers, they say, give whales for dowers to their daughters and portion off their nieces with a few porpoises apiece.
We must go to New Bedford to see a brilliant wedding, for, they say, they have reservoirs of oil in every house, every night recklessly burn their lamps in spermaceti candles. In summertime, the town is sweet to see, full of fine maples, long avenues of green and gold. And in August, high in air, the beautiful and bountiful horse chestnuts, candelabra-wise, proffer the passerby their tapering upright cones of congregated blossom. So omnipotent is art, which in many a district of New Bedford has superinduced bright terraces of flowers. Upon the barren, refuse rocks thrown aside at creation's final day. And the women of New Bedford, they bloom like their own red roses. But roses only bloom in summer, whereas the fine carnation of their cheeks is perennial as sunlight in the seventh heavens. Elsewhere match that bloom of theirs ye cannot, save in Salem, where they tell me the young girls breathe such must. Their sailor sweethearts smell them miles offshore, as though they were drawing nigh the odorous Moluccas instead of the puritanic sand. When we have also 12 coalition. In this same New Bedford there stands a whaleman's chapel. Few are the moody fishermen, shortly bound for the Indian Ocean or Pacific, who fail to make a Sunday visit to the spot. I am sure that I did not. Returning from my first morning stroll, I again sallied out upon this special errand. The sky had clear, sunny cold to driving in mist. Wrapping myself in my shaggy jacket of the cloth called bearskin, I fought my way against the stubborn storm. Entering, I found a small, scattered congregation of sailors and sailors' wives and widows. A muffled silence reigned, only broken at times by the shrieks of the storm. Each silent worshipper seemed purposely sitting apart from the other, as if each silent grief were insular and the chaplain had not yet arrived. And there, these silent islands of men and women sat steadfastly, eyeing several marble tablets with black borders, masoned into the wall on either side the pulpit. 3 of them ran something like the following, but I do not pretend to quote. Sacred to the memory of John Talbot. It would be a few other videos in war, or a mummy up to view, who at the age of 18 was lost overboard, near Isle of Desolation, off Patagonia, November 1 Sturt, 1836. This tablet is erected to his memory by his sister, Willis Ellery, Nathan Coleman, Walter Canny, Seth Macy, and Samuel Glide, forming one of the boat's crews of the ship Eliza, who were towed out of sight by a whale on the offshore. This marble is here placed by their surviving shipmate, sacred to the memory of the late Captain Ezekiel Hardy, who in the bows of his boat was killed by a sperm whale on the coast of Japan, August 3d, 1833. This tablet is erected to his memory by his widow. Shaking off the sleet from my ice-grays hat and jacket, I seated myself near the door, and turning sideways was surprised to see Queequeg near. Affected by the solemnity of the scene, there was a wondering gaze of incredulous curiosity in his countenance. This savage was the only person present who seemed to notice my entrance, because he was the only one who could not read, and therefore was not reading those frigid inscriptions on the wall. Whether any of the relatives of the seamen whose names appeared there were now among the congregation, I knew not. But so many are the unrecorded accidents in the fishery, and so plainly did several women present, where the countenance, if not the trappings, of some unceasing grief, that I feel sure that here before me were assembled those, in whose unhealing hearts the sight of those bleak tablets sympathetically caused the old wounds to bleed afresh. Oh, ye, whose dead lie, buried beneath the green grass, who, standing among flowers, can say, Here, here lies my beloved. Yeah, know not the desolation that broods in bosoms like these. What bitter blanks in those black-bordered marbles which cover no ashes. What despair in those immovable inscriptions. What deadly voids and unbidden infidelities in the lines that seem to gnaw upon all faith and refuse resurrections to the names who have placelessly without a grave. As well might those tablets stand a cave of Elephanta, as here, in what census of living creatures the dead of mankind are included. Why it is that a universal proverb says of them that they tell no tales, though containing more secrets than the Goodwin Sands. How it is that to him who yesterday departed for the other world, we prefix so significant and infidel a word, and yet do not thus entitle him, if he but embarks for the remotest Indies of this. Why the life insurance companies pay death forfeitures upon immortals, in what eternal, unstarring paralysis and deadly, hopeless trance yet lies antique Adam, who died 60 round centuries ago. How it is that we still refuse to be comforted for those who we nevertheless maintain are dwelling in unspeakable bliss. Why all the living so strive to hush all the dead. Wherefore, but the rumor of a knocking in the tomb will terrify a whole city. All these things are not without their meaning, but faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs, and even from these dead doubts, she gathers her most vital hope. It needs scarcely to be told with what feelings, on the eve of the Nantucket voyage, I regarded those marble tablets, and by the murky light of that dark and doleful day read the fate of the whalemen who had gone before me. Yes, Ishmael, the same fate may be thine. But somehow I grew merry again. Delightful inducements to embark, find chance for promotion it seems. I, a stove-boat, will make me an immortal by brevet. Yes, there is death in this business of whaling, a speechlessly quick, chaotic bundling of a man into eternity. But what then? Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Thinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters observing the sun through the water, and thinking that thick water the thinnest of air. Methinks my body is but the lees of my better being. In fact, take my body, who will. Take it, I say, it is not me. And therefore, 3 cheers for Nantucket, and come a stove boat and stove body when it will, for stave my soul, Jove himself. Chapter 8. I had not been seated very long ere a man of a certain venerable robustness entered. Immediately as the storm-pelted door flew back upon admitting him, a quick regardful eyeing of him by all the congregation sufficiently attested that this fine old man was the chaplain. Yes, it was the famous Father Melville, so called by the wind. He had been a sailor and a harpooner in his youth, but for many years past had dedicated his life to the ministry. At the time I now write of, Father Melville was in the hardy winter of a healthy old age. That sort of old age which seems merging into a second flowering youth, for among all the fissures of his wrinkles, there shone certain mild gleams of a newly developing bloom, the spring verdure peeping forth even beneath February snow. No one, having previously heard his history, could for the first time behold Father Melville without the utmost interest, because there were certain engrafted clerical peculiarities about him, imputable to that adventurous maritime life when he entered. I observed that he carried no umbrella, and certainly had not come in his carriage, for his tarpaulin hat ran down with melting sleet, and his great pilot cloth jacket seemed almost to drag him to the floor, with the weight of the water it had absorbed. However, hat and coat and overshoes were one by one removed and hung up in a little space in an adjacent corner, left. When, arrayed in a decent suit, he quietly approached the pulpit. Like most old-fashioned pulpits, it was a very lofty one, and since irregular stairs to such a height would, by its long angle with the floor, seriously contract the already small area of the chapel, the architect, it seemed, had acted upon the hint of Father Melville, and finished the pulpit without a stairs, substituting a perpendicular side ladder, like those used in mounting a ship from a boat at sea. The wife of a whaling captain had provided the chapel with a handsome pair of red worsted man-ropes for this ladder, which being itself nicely headed, and stained with a mahogany color, the whole contrivance, considering what manner of chapel it was, seemed by no means. Halting for an instant at the foot of the ladder, and with both hands grasping the ornamental knobs of the man-ropes, Father Melville cast a look upwards, and then, with a truly sailor-like but still reverential dexterity, hand over hand, mounted the steps as if ascending the main-top of his vessel. The perpendicular parts of this side ladder, as is usually the case with swimmings, were of cloth-covered rope, only the rounds were of wood, so that at every step there was a... At my first glimpse of the pulpit, it had not escaped me that however convenient for a ship, these joints in the present instance seemed unnecessary, for I was not prepared to see Father Melville, after gaining the height, slowly turn round, and stooping over the pulpit, deliberately drag up the ladder step by step, till the whole was deposited impregnable in its little... I pondered some time without fully comprehending the reason for this. Father Melville enjoyed such a wide reputation of sincerity and sanctity, that I could not suspect him of courting notoriety by any mere tricks of the stage. Now that I There must be some sober reason for this thing. Furthermore, it must symbolize something unseen. Can it be then that by that act of physical isolation, he signifies his spiritual withdrawal for the time from all outward worldly ties? Yes, for replenished with the meat and wine of the word, to the faithful man of God, this pulpit, I see, is a self-containing stronghold. A lofty Aaron Brightstein, with a perennial well of water within the walls. But the side ladder was not the only strange the place, far from the chapel and seafarings. Between the marble cenotaphs on either hand of the pulpit, the wall which formed its back was adorned with a large painting representing a gallant ship beating against a terrible storm off a lee coast of black rocks and snowy. But high above the flying scud and dark rolling clouds, there floated a little isle of sunlight, from which beamed forth an angel's face. And this bright face shed a distinct spot of radiance upon the ship's tossed deck, something like that silver plate now inserted into Victory's plank, where Nelson fell. Ah, noble ship, the angel seemed to say, beat on, thou noble ship, and bear a hearty helm. For lo, the sun is breaking through, the clouds are rolling off, Serenus, azure, is at hand. Nor was the pulpit itself without a trace of the sea taste that had achieved the ladder and the picture. Its paneled front was in the likeness of a ship's bluff bows, and the Holy Bible rested on a projecting piece of scrollwork, fashioned after a ship's fiddle, had a beak. What could be more full of meaning? For the pulpit is ever this earth's foremost part. All the rest comes in its rear. The pulpit leads the world. From thence, it is the storm of God's quick wrath is first descried, and the bow must bear the earliest brunt. From thence, it is the God of breezes fair or foul is first invoked for favorable. Yes, the world's a ship on its passage out, and not a voyage complete, and the pulpit is its prow. Chapter 9. Father Mapple rose, and in a mild voice of unassuming authority, ordered the scattered people to condense. Starboard gangway there. Side away to larboard. Larboard gangway to starboard. Midships. There was a low rumbling of heavy sea boots among the benches, and a still slighter shuffling of women's shoes. And all was quiet again, and every eye on the preacher. He paused a little, and kneeling in the pulpit's bows, folded his large brown hands across his chest, uplifted his closed eyes, and offered a prayer so deeply devout that he seemed kneeling and praying at the bottom of the sea. This ended in prolonged solemn tones, like the continual tolling of a bell in a ship but is foundering at sea in a fog. In such tones he commenced reading the following hymn, but changing his manner towards the concluding stanzas, burst forth with appealing exultation and joy. The ribs and terrors and the wail arched over me a dismal, while all God's sunlit waves rolled by and lifted me deepening down to. I saw the opening maw of hell, with endless pains and sorrows there, which none but they that feel can tell. Oh, I was plunged into despair, in black distress. I called my God. When I could scarce believe in mine, he bowed his ear to my complaints. No more the wail did me confine. With speed he flew to my relief, as on a radiant dolphin, awful yet bright, as lightning shone, with face of my deliverer God. My song forever shall record that terrible, that joyful hour. I give the glory to my God, his all the mercy and the power. Nearly all joined in singing this hymn, which swelled high above the howling of the storm. Brief pause ensued. The preacher slowly turned over the leaves of the Bible, and at last, folding his hand down upon the proper page, said, Beloved shipmates, clinched the last verse of the first chapter of Jonah, and God had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Shipmates, this book, containing only 4 chapters, 4 yarns, is one of the smallest strands in the mighty cable of the Scripture. Yet, what depths of the soul does Jonah's deep sea line sound? What a pregnant lesson to us is this prophet. What a noble thing is that canticle in the fish's belly. How billow-like and boisterously grand. We feel the floods surging over us. We sound with him to the kelpy bottom of the waters. Seaweed and all the slime of the sea is about us. But what is this lesson that the book of Jonah teaches? Shipmates, it is a two-stranded lesson. A lesson to us all as sinful men, and a lesson to me as a pilot of the living God. As sinful men, it is a lesson to us all, because it is a story of the sin, hard-heartedness, suddenly awakened fears, the swift punishment, repentance, prayer. As with all sinners among men, the sin of this son of Amittai was in his willful disobedience of the command of God. Never mind now what that command was, or how conveyed, which he found a hard command. But all the things that God would have us do are hard for us. Remember that, and hence he oftener commits us than endeavors to persuade. And if we obey God, we must disobey ourselves. In this disobeying ourselves, wherein the hardness of obeying God consists. And with this sin of disobedience in him, Jonah still further flouts at God by seeking to flee from him. He thinks that a ship made by men will carry him into countries where God does not reign, but only the captains of this earth. He skulks about the wharves of Joppa and seeks a ship that's bound for Tarshish. There lurks, perhaps, a hitherto unheeded meaning here. By all accounts, Tarshish could have been no other city than the modern Cadiz. That's the opinion of learned men. And where is Cadiz, shipmates? Cadiz is in Spain, as far by water from Joppa as Jonah could possibly have sailed in those ancient days, when the Atlantic was an almost unknown sea. Because Joppa, the modern Jaffa, shipmates, is on the most easterly coast of the Mediterranean, the Syrian, and Tarshish or Cadiz more than 2,000 miles to the westward from that, just outside the Straits of Gibraltar. See ye not then, shipmates, that Jonah sought to flee worldwide from God? Miserable man! Ah, most contemptible and worthy of all scorn, with slouched hat and guilty eye, skulking from his God, prowling among the shipping like a vile burglar, hastening to cross the sea. So, disordered, self-condemning is his look, that had the policemen in those days, Jonah, on the mere suspicion of something wrong, been arrested ere he touched a deck. How plainly he's a fugitive. No baggage, not a hatbox, valise, or carpetbag. No friends accompany him to the wharf with their adieu. At last, after a much dodging search, he finds the Tarshish ship receiving the last items of her cargo, and as he steps on board to see its captain in the cabin, all the sailors for the moment desist from hoisting in the goods to mark the strangeful eye. Jonah sees this, but in vain he tries to look all ease and confident. In vain essays his wretched smile. Strong intuitions of the man assure the mariners he can be no innocent. In their gangsome but still serious way, one whispers to the other, "Jack, he's robbed a widow," or "Joe, do you mark him? He's a bigamist," or "Harry lad, I guess he's the adulterer that broke jail in old Gomorrah," or "Gaelic, one of the missing merchant Sodom." Another runs to read the bill that's stuck against the spile upon the wharf to which the ship is moored, offering 500 gold coins for the apprehension of a parricide, and containing a description of his person. He reads and looks from Jonah to the bill, while all his sympathetic shipmates now crowd round Jonah, prepared to lay their hands upon him. Frighted Jonah trembles, and summoning all his boldness to his face, only looks so much the more a coward. He will not confess himself suspected, but that itself is strong suspicion. So he makes the best of it. And when the sailors find him not to be the man that is advertised, they let him pass, and he descends into the cabin. "Who's there?" cries the captain at his busy desk, hurriedly making out his papers for the customs. "Who's there?" Oh, how that harmless question mangles Jonah. For the instant, he almost turns to flee again. But he rallies. I seek a passage in this ship to Tarshish. How soon sail ye, sir? Thus far the busy captain had not looked up to, though the man now stands before him. But no sooner does he hear that hollow voice than he darts a scrutinizing glance. We sail with the next coming tide. At last he slowly answered, still intently eyeing. No sooner, sir. Soon enough for any honest man that goes a passenger. Ha! Jonah, that's another stab. But he swiftly calls away the captain from that scent. I'll sail with ye, he says. The passage money, how much is that? I'll pay now. For it is particularly written, shipmate, as if it were a thing not to be overlooked in this history, that he paid the fare thereof ere the craft did sail. And taken with the context, this is full of meaning. Jonah's captain, shipmates, was one whose discernment detects crime in any, but whose cupidity exposes it only in the penniless. In this world, shipmates, sin that pays its way can travel and without a passport, whereas virtue, if a pauper, is stalked at all frontiers. So Jonah's captain prepares to test the length of his purse. Ere he judge him openly, he charges him thrice the usual sum, and it's assented to. Then the captain knows that Jonah is a fugitive, but at the same time resolves to help a flight that paves its reel with gold. So, yet, when Jonah fairly takes out his purse, prudent suspicions still molest the captain. He rings every coin to find a counterfeit, not a forger, anyway, he mutters, and Jonah is put down for his passage. Point out my stateroom, sir, says Jonah now. I'm travel-weary. I need sleep. Thou lookest like it, says the captain. There's thy room. Jonah enters and would lock the door, but the lock contains no key. Hearing him foolishly fumbling there, the captain laughs lowly to himself and mutters something about the doors of convict cells being never allowed to be locked within. All dressed and dusty as he is, Jonah throws himself into his berth and finds the little stateroom ceiling almost resting on his forehead. The air's close, and Jonah gasps. Then, in that contracted hull, sunk too beneath the ship's waterline, Jonah feels the heralding presentiment of that stifling hour, when the whale shall hold him in the smallest of his bowels words. Screwed at its axis against the side, a swinging lamp slightly oscillates in Jonah's room, and the ship, heeling over towards the wharf with the weight of the last bales received, the lamp, flame and all, though in slight motion, still maintains a permanent obliquity with reference to the room. Though, in truth, infallibly straight itself, it but made obvious the false levels among which it hung. The lamp alarms and frightens Jonah, as lying in his berth, his tormented eyes roll round the place, and this thus far successful fugitive finds no refuge for his restless glance. But that contradiction in the lamp more and more appalls him. The floor, the ceiling, and the side are all awry. Oh, so my conscience hazen. He groans straight upwards, so it burns. But the chambers of my soul are all in crookedness, like one who after a night of drunken revelry eyes to his bed, still reeling, but with conscience yet pricking him, as the plungings of the Roman racehorse, but so much the more strike the steel tags in, is one who, in that miserable plight, still turns and turns in giddy anger, praying God for annihilation until the fit be past. And at last, amid the whirl of woe he feels, a deep stupor steals over him, as over the man who bleeds to death, for conscience is the wound, and there's naught to staunch it. So after sore wrestlings in his berth, Jonah's prodigy of ponderous misery drags him, drowning down to sleep. And now the time of tide has come. The ship casts off her cables, and from the deserted wharf, the uncheered ship for Tarshish, all careening, glides to sea. That ship, my friends, was the first of recorded smugglers. The contraband was Jonah. But the sea rebels, he will not bear the wicked burden. A dreadful storm comes on. The ship is like to break. But now, when the boatswain calls all hands to lighten her, when boxes, bales, and jars are clattering overboard, when the wind is shrieking, and the men are yelling, and every plank thunders with trampling feet right over Jonah's head, in all this raging tumult, Jonah sleeps his hideous sleep. He sees no black sky, and raging sea, feels not the reeling timbers, and little hears he the far rush of the mighty whale, which even now with open mouth is cleaving the seas after. Aye, shipmates, Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, a berth in the cabin as I have taken it, and was fast asleep. But the frightened master comes to him and shrieks in his dead ear, "What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise." Startled from his lethargy by that direful cry, Jonah staggers to his feet, and stumbling to the deck, grasps a shroud to look out upon the sea. But at that moment he is sprung upon by a panther billow, leaping over the bulwarks. Wave after wave thus leaps into the ship, and finding no speedy vent, runs roaring fore and aft, till the mariners come nigh to drowning while yet afloat. And ever, as the white moon shows her frighted face from the steep gullies in the blackness overhead, aghast Jonah sees the rearing bowsprit pointing high upward, but soon beat downward again towards the tormented deep. Terrors upon terrors run shouting through his soul. In all his cringing attitudes, the god-fugitive is now too plainly known. The sailors mark him. More and more certain grow their suspicions of him, and at last, fully to test the truth, by referring the whole matter to high heaven, they fall to casting lots, to see for whose cause this great tempest was upon them. A lot is Jonah's, but discovered, then how furiously they mob him with their question. What is thine occupation? Good. Whence comest thou? Thy country. What people? But mark now, my shipmates, the behavior of poor Jonah. The eager mariners but ask him who he is and where from, whereas they not only receive an answer to those questions, but likewise another answer to a question not put by them. But the unsolicited answer is forced from Jonah by the hard hand of God that is, "I am a Hebrew," he cries, and then, "I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who hath made the sea and the dry land." Fear him, O Jonah? Aye, well Midas, thou fear the Lord God. Then, straightway, he now goes on to make a full confession. Whereupon, the mariners became more and more appalled, but still are pitiful. For when Jonah, not yet supplicating God for mercy, since he but too well knew the darkness of his desert, when wretched Jonah cries out to them to take him and cast him forth into the sea, for he knew that for his sake this great tempest was upon them, they mercifully turn from him and seek by other means to save the ship. But all in vain. The indignant gale howls louder. Then with one hand raised invokingly to God, with the other they not unreluctantly lay hold of Jonah. And now behold Jonah taken up as an anchor and dropped into the sea, when instantly an oily calmness floats out from the east, and the sea is still, as Jonah carries down the gale with him, leaving smooth water behind. He goes down in the whirling hard of such a masterless commotion that he scarce heeds the moment when he drops, seething into the yawning jaws awaiting. And the whale shoots to all his ivory teeth with so many white bolts upon his prison. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord out of the fish's belly. But observe his prayer, and learn a weighty lesson. For sinful as he is, Jonah does not weep and wail for direct deliverance. He feels that his dreadful punishment is just. He leaves all his deliverance to God, contenting himself with this, that spite of all his pains, he will still look towards his hope. And here, shipmates, is true and faithful repentance, not clamorous for pardon, but grateful for punishment. And how pleasing to God was this conduct in Jonah is shown in the eventual deliverance of him from the sea and the whale. Shipmates, I do not place Jonah before you to be copied for his sin, but I do place him before you as a model for repentance. Sin not. But if you do, take heed to repent of it, like Jonah. While he was speaking these words, the howling of the shrieking, slanting storm without seemed to add new power to the preacher, who, when describing Jonah's sea storm, seemed tossed by a storm himself. His deep chest heaved as with a groundswell. His tossed arms seemed the warring elements at work, and the fenders that rolled away from off his swarthy brow, and the light leaping from his eye made all his simple hearers look on him with a quick fear that was strange to him. There now came a lull in his look, as he silently turned over the leaves of the book once more, and at last, standing motionless, with closed eyes, for the moment, communing with God and himself. But again, he leaned over towards the people, and bowing his head lowly, with an aspect of the deepest yet manliest humility, he spake these words: Shipmates, God has laid the one hand upon me. Both his hands press upon me. I have read ye, by what murky light may be mine the lesson that Jonah teaches to all sinners, and therefore to ye, and still more to me, for I am a greater sinner than ye. And now how gladly would I come down from this masthead, and sit on the hatches there, where you sit, and listen as you listen, while some one of you reads me that other and more awful lesson, which Jonah teach as a pirate of the living God, how being an anointed pilot prophet or speaker of truth, and bidden by the Lord to sound those unwelcome truths in the ears of a wicked, appalled at the hostility he should raise, fled from his, and sought to escape his duty and his God by taking ship at Joppa. But God is everywhere. Tarshish, he never reached. As we have seen, God came upon him in the whale and swallowed him down to living gulfs of doom, and with swift slantings tore him along into the midst of the seas, where the eddying depths sucked him 10,000 fathoms down, and the weeds were wrapped about his head, and all the watery world of woe bulged over him. Yet even then, beyond the reach of any plummet out of the belly of hell, when the whale grounded upon the ocean's utmost bounds, even then, God heard the engulfed, repenting prophet when he cried. Then God spake unto the fish, and from the shuddering cold and blackness of the sea, the whale came breaching up towards the warm and pleasant sun, and all the delights of air and earth, and vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. When the word of the Lord came a second time, and Jonah bruised and beaten, his ears, like two seashells, still multitudinously murmuring of the ocean. Jonah did the Almighty's bidding. And what was that? Shipmates, to preach the truth to the face of falsehood. That was it. This. Shipmates, this is that other lesson. And woe to that pirate of the living God. He slights it. Woe to him whom this world charms from gospel. Woe to him who seeks to pour oil upon the waters when God has brewed them into a gale. Woe to him who seeks to please rather than to appall. Woe to him whose good name is more to him than goodness. Woe to him who, in this world, courts not dishonor. Woe to him who would not be true, even though to be false were salvation. Yea, woe to him who, as the great pilot Paul has it, while preaching to others, is himself a castellan. He dropped and fell away from himself for a moment, then lifting his face to them again, showed a deep joy in his eyes, as he cried out with a heavenly enthusiasm. But, oh, shipmates, on the starboard hand of every woe, there is a sure delight, and higher the top of that delight than the bottom of the woe. Is not the main truck higher than the kelson is low? Delight is to him a far, far upward, inward delight, who against the proud gods and commodores of this earth ever stands forth his own inexorable self. Delight is to him whose strong arms yet support him when the ship of this base, treacherous world has gone down beneath him. Delight is to him who gives no quarter in the truth, and kills, burns, and destroys all sin, though he pluck it out from under the robes of senators and judges. Delight, top-gallant delight, is to him, who acknowledges no law or lord, but the Lord his God is only a patron to heaven. Delight is to him, whom all the waves of the billows, of the seas of the boisterous mob, can never shake from the sure keel of the ages. And eternal delight and deliciousness will be his, who coming to lay him down, can say with his final breath, O Father, chiefly known to me by thy rod, mortal or immortal, here I die. I have striven to be thine, more than to be this, world's or mine own. Yet, this is nothing. I leave eternity, for what is man that he should live out the lifetime of his God? He said no more, but slowly waving a benediction, covered his face with his hands, and so remained kneeling, till all the people had departed, and he was left alone in the place. Chapter 10. Returning to the Spouter Inn from the chapel, I found Pequod there quite alone. Having left the chapel before the benediction, he was sitting on a bench before the fire, with his feet on the stove hearth, and in one hand was holding close to his face that little Negro idol of his, peering hard into its face, and with a jackknife gently whittling away at its nose, meanwhile humming to himself in his heathenish way. But being now interrupted, he put up the image, and pretty soon, going to the table, took up a large book there, and placing it on his lap, began counting the pages with deliberate regularity. At every 50th page, as I fancied, stopping a moment, looking vacantly around him, and giving utterance to a long-drawn, gurgling whistle of astonishment, he would then begin at the next 50, seeming to commence at number 1 each time, as though he could not count more than 50. And it was only by such a large number of 50s being found together that his astonishment at the multitude of pages was excited. With much interest, I sat watching him, savage though he was, and hideously marred about the face, at least to my taste. His countenance yet had a something in it which was by no means readable. You cannot hide the soul. Through all his unearthly tattooings, I thought I saw the traces of a simple, honest heart, and in his large, deep eyes, fiery black and bold, there seemed tokens of a spirit that would dare 1,000 devils. And besides all this, there was a certain lofty bearing about the pagan, which even his uncoverness could not altogether make. He looked like a man who had never cringed, and never had had a creditor. Whether it was, too, that his head being shaved, his forehead was drawn out in freer and brighter and looked more expansive than it otherwise would, this I will not venture to decide. But certain it was his head was phenologically an excellent one. It may seem ridiculous, but it reminded me of General Washington's head, as seen in the popular busts of him. It had the same long, regularly graded, reaching slope from above the brows, which were likewise very projecting, like 2 long promontories thickly on top. Pequod was George Washington cannibalistically developed. Whilst I was thus closely scanning him, half pretending meanwhile to be looking out at the storm from the casement, he never heeded my presence, never troubled himself with so much as a single glance, but appeared wholly occupied with countings of the marvelous, considering how sociably we had been sleeping together the night previous, and especially considering the affectionate arm I had found thrown over me upon waking. I thought this indifference of his very short. But savages are strange beings. At times you do not know exactly how to take them. At first, they are overawing. Their calm self-collectedness of simplicity seems a Socratic wisdom. I had noticed also that Pequod never consorted at all, or but very little, with the other seamen in the inn. He made no advances whatever, appeared to have no desire to enlarge the circle of his. All this struck me as mighty singular, yet upon second thoughts, there was something almost sublime in it. Here was a man some 20,000 miles from home, by the way of Cape Horn, that is, which was the only way he could get there, thrown among people as strange to him as though he were Jupiter. But now he seemed entirely at his ease, reserving the utmost serenity, content with his own companionship, always equal to himself. Surely this was a touch of fine philosophy, though no doubt he had never heard there was such a thing. But perhaps, to be true philosophers, we mortals should not be conscious of, so living, or so striving. So soon as I hear that such or such a man gives himself out for a philosopher, I conclude that, like the dyspeptic old woman, he must have broken his digester. As I sat there in that now lonely room, the fire burning low in that mild stage, when after its first has warmed the air, it then only glows to be looked at. The evening shades and phantoms gathering round the casements, and peering in upon us, silent, solitary. The storm booming without in solemn swells. I began to be sensible of strange feelings. I felt a melting in me. No more my splintered heart and maddened hand were turned against the wolfish world. The suiting savage had redeemed it. There he sat, his very indifference, speaking a nature in which there lurked no civilized hypocrisies and bland deceits. Wild he was, the very sight of sights to see. Yet I began to feel myself mysteriously drawn towards him, and those same things that would have repelled most others, they were the very magnets that thus drew me. I'll try a pagan friend, but by kindness has proved but hollow courtesy. I drew my bench near him, and made some friendly signs and hints, doing my best to talk with him meanwhile. At first he little noticed these advances. Presently, upon my referring to his last night's hospitalities, he made out to ask me whether we were again to be bedfellows. I told him yes. Whereat I felt he looked pleased, perhaps a little complimented. We then turned over the book together, and I endeavored to explain to him the purpose of the printing and the meaning of the few pictures that were in it. Thus I soon engaged his interest, and from that we went to jabbering the best we could about the various outer sights to be seen in this famous town. Soon I proposed a social smoke, and producing his pouch and tomahawk, he quietly offered me a puff. And then we sat exchanging puffs from that wild pipe of his, and keeping it regularly passing between us. If there yet lurked any ice of indifference towards me in the pagan's breast, this pleasant meal smoke we had soon thawed it out, and left us cronies. He seemed to take to me quite as naturally and unbiddenly as I had to him. And when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me round the waist, and said that henceforth we were married, meaning, in his country's phrase, that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me, if need should be. And a countryman, this sudden flame of friendship would have seemed far too premature, a thing to be much distrusted. But in the simple savage, those old rules would not apply. After supper and another social chat in Snulk, we went to our room together. He made me a present of his embalmed head, took out his enormous tobacco wallet, and grouping under the tobacco, drew out some $30 in silver. Then spreading them on the table, and mechanically dividing them into two equal portions, pushed one of them towards me and said it was mine. I was going to remonstrate, but he silenced me by pouring them into my trousers pocket. I let them stay. He then went about his evening prayers, took out his idol, and removed the paper fireboard. By certain signs and symptoms, I thought he seemed anxious for me, but, well, knowing what was to follow, I deliberated a moment whether, in case he invited me, I would comply or otherwise. I was a good Christian, born and bred in the bosom of the infallible Presbyterian Church. So how then could I unite with this wild idolater in worshipping his piece of wood? But what is worship? Thought. Do you suppose now, Ishmael, that the magnanimous God of heaven and earth, pagans and all included, can possibly be jealous of an insignificant bit of black wood? Impossible. But what is worship? To do the will of God, that is worship. And what is the will of God. To do to my fellow man what I would have my fellow man to do to me. That is the will of God. Now, Pequod is my fellow man. And what do I wish that this Pequod would do to me? Why? Unite with me in my particular Presbyterian form of worship. Consequently, I must then unite with him his. Ergo, I must turn idol. So I kindled the shavings, helped prop up the innocent little idol, offered him burnt biscuit with Pequod, salaamed before him twice or thrice. He kissed his nose, and that done, we undressed and went to bed at peace with our own conscience and all the world. But we did not go to sleep without some little chat. How it is, I know not. But there is no place like a bed for confidential disclosures between friends. Man and wife, they say, they're open the very bottom of their souls to each other. And some old couples often lie and chat over old times till nearly morning. Thus then, in our heart honeymoon, lay I and Crewplank, a cozy, loving pair. Chapter 11. We had been thus in bed, chatting and napping at short intervals, and Pequod now and then affectionately throwing his brown tattooed legs over mine, and then drawing them back. So entirely sociable and free and easy, when at last, by reason of our confabulation, what little nappishness remained in us altogether departed, and we felt like getting up again, though daybreak was yet some way down the future. Yes, we became very wakeful, so much so that our recumbent position began to grow wearisome, and by little and little, we found ourselves sitting up, the clothes well tucked around us, leaning against the headboard, with our four knees drawn up close together, and our two noses bending over them, as if our knee pans are warming pans. We felt very nice and snug, the more so since it was so chilly out of doors. Indeed, out of bed, clothes too, seeing that there was no fire. The more so, I say, because truly to enjoy bodily warmth, some small part of you must be cold. For there is no quality in this world that is not what it is, merely by contrast. Nothing exists in itself. You flatter yourself that you are all overconfident, and have been so a long time. Don't be said to be comfortable any. But if, like Craig and me in the bed, the tip of your nose or the crown of your head be slightly chilled, why then indeed, in the general consciousness, you feel most delightful and unmistakable. For this reason, a sleeping apartment should never be furnished with a fire, which is one of the luxurious discomforts of the rich. For the height of this sort of deliciousness is to have nothing but the blanket in your snugness, and the cold of the outer air. Then there you lie like the one warm spark in the heart of an Arctic crystal. We had been sitting in this crouching manner for some time, when all at once I thought I would open my eyes, or when between sheets, whether by day or by night, and whether asleep or awake. I have a way of always keeping my eyes shut, in order the more to concentrate the snugness of being in bed. Because no man can ever feel his own identity right except his eyes be closed. As if darkness were indeed the proper element of our essences, the light be more congenial to our clayey part. Upon opening my eyes then, and coming out of my own pleasant and self-created darkness, the imposed and coarse outer gloom of the unilluminated 12 o'clock at night, I experienced a disagreeable revulsion. Nor did I at all object to the hint from Pequod that perhaps it were best to strike a light, seeing that we were so wide awake, and besides, he felt a strong desire to have a few quiet puffs from his tomahawk. Be it said, that though I had felt such a strong repugnance to his smoking in the bed the night before, yet see how elastic our stiff prejudices grow when love once comes to bend them. For now, I like nothing better than to have Queequeg smoking by me, even in bed, because he seemed to be full of such serene household joy then. I no more felt unduly concerned for the landlord's policy of insurance. I was only alive to the condensed, confidential comfortableness of sharing a pipe and a blanket with a real friend. with our shaggy jackets drawn about our shoulders, we now passed the tomahawk from one to the other, till slowly there grew over us a blue hanging tester of smoke, illuminated by the flame of the new lit lamp. Whether it was that this undulating tester rolled the savage away to far distant scene, I know not, but he now spoke of his native island. And eager to hear his history, I begged him to go on and tell it. He gravely complied, though at the time I but comprehended not a few of his words. Yet subsequent disclosures, when I had become more familiar with his broken phraseology, now enable me to present the whole story, such as it may prove in the mere skeleton I give. Chapter 12. Queequeg was a native of Roco, an island far away to the west and south. It is not down on any map. True places never are. When a new-hatched savage, running wild about his native woodlands in a grass clout, followed by the nibbling goats, as if he were a green sapling, even then, in Queequeg's ambitious soul, lurked a strong desire to see something more of Christendom than a specimen whaler or two. His father was a high chief, a king, his uncle a high priest, and on the maternal side, he boasted aunts who were the wives of unconquerable warriors. There was excellent blood, royal stuff, and though sadly vitiated, I fear, by the cannibal propensity he nourished in his untutored youth, a Sag Harbor ship visited his father's bay, and Queequeg sought a passage to Christian lands. But the ship, having her full complement of seamen, spurned him, and not all the king, his father's influence, could prevail. But Queequeg vowed a vow. Alone in his canoe, he paddled off to a distant strait, which he knew the ship must pass through when she quitted the island. On one side was a coral reef, on the other a low tongue of land covered with mangrove thickets that grew out into the water. Hiding his canoe, still afloat among these thickets, with its prow seaward, he sat down in the stern, paddle low in hand, and when the ship was gliding by, like a flash, he darted out, gained her side. With one backward dash of his foot, capsized and sank his canoe, climbed up the chains, and throwing himself at full length upon the deck, grappled a ring-bolt there, and swore not to let it go, though hacked in vain. The captain threatened to throw him overboard, suspended a cutlass over his naked wrists. Queequeg was the son of a king, and Queequeg budged not. Struck by his desperate dauntlessness and his wild desire to visit Christendom, the captain at last relented and told him he might make himself at home. But this fine young savage, this sea prince of Wales, never saw the captain's cabin. They put him down among the sailors and made a whaleman of him. Alike Czar Peter content to toil in the shipyards of foreign cities, Queequeg disdained no seeming ignominy, if thereby he might happily gain the power of enlightening his untutored country. For at bottom, so he told me, he was actuated by a profound desire to learn among the Christians the arts whereby to make people still happier than they, and more than that, still better than they were. But, alas, the practices of whalemen soon convinced him that even Christians could be both miserable, infinitely more so than all his father's heathens. Arrived at last in Old Sag Harbor, and seeing what the sailors did there, and then going on to Nantucket, and seeing how they spent their wages in that place also, poor Queequeg gave it up for lost. But it's a wicked world in all meridians. I'll die a pagan, and thus an old idolater at heart. He yet lived among these Christians, wore their clothes, and tried to talk their gibberish. Hence the queer ways about him, though now some time from home. Why hence? I asked him whether he did not propose going back and having a coronation, since he might now consider his father dead and gone, he being very old and feeble at the last account. He answered, no, not yet, and added that he was fearful Christianity, or rather Christians, had unfitted him for ascending the pure and undefiled throne of 30 pagan kings before him. But By and by, he said, he would return as soon as he felt himself baptized again. For the nonce, however, he proposed to sail about and sow his wild oats in all 4 oceans. They had made a harpooner of him, and that barbed iron was in lieu of the scepter now. I asked him what might be his immediate purpose. Touching his future movement, he answered, to go to sea again, in his old vocation. Upon this, I told him that whaling was my own design, and informed him of my intention to sail out of Nantucket, as being the most promising port for an adventurous whaleman to embark from. He at once resolved to accompany me to that island, ship aboard the same vessel, get into the same watch, the same boat, the same mess with me, in short, to share my every hap. With both my hands in his, boldly dip into the potluck of both. To all this, I joyously assented, for besides the affection I now felt for Queequeg, he was an experienced harpooner, and as such could not fail to be of great usefulness to one who, like me, was wholly ignorant of the mysteries of the well-acquainted. His story ended with his pipe's last dying puff. Queequeg embraced me, pressed his forehead against mine, and blowing out the light, we rolled over from each other, this way and that, and very soon were sleeping. Chapter 13. Next morning, Monday, after disposing of the embalmed head to a barber for a block, I settled my own and comrade's bill, using, however, my comrade's money. The grinning landlord, as well as the boarders, seemed amazingly tickled at the sudden friendship which had sprung up between me and Pequod, especially as Peter Coffin's cock and bull stories about him had previously so much alarmed me concerning the very person I now accompanied. I recognized the ones that he published. We borrowed a wheelbarrow, and embarking our things, including my own poor carpet bag, and Queequeg's canvas sack and hammock, away we went down to the Moss, the little Nantucket packet schooner moored at the wharf. As we were going along, the people stared, not at Queequeg so much, for they were used to seeing cannibals, like him in their streets, but at seeing him and me upon such confidential terms. But we heeded them not, going along wheeling the barrow by turns, and Queequeg now and then stopping to adjust the sheath on his harpoon barbs. I asked him why he carried such a troublesome thing to him ashore, and whether all whaling ships did not find their own harpoons. To this, in substance, he replied that though what I'd hinted was true enough, yet he had a particular affection for his own harpoon, because it was of assured stuff, well tried in many a mortal combat, deeply intimate with the hearts of whales. In short, like many illers and mowers, who go into the farmer's armed with their own scythes, though in no wise obliged to furnish them. Even so, Queequeg, for his own private reason, preferred his own harpoon. And shifting the barrel from my hand to his, he told me a funny story about the first wheelbarrow he had ever seen. It was in Sag Harbor. The owners of his ship, it seems, had lent him one, in which to carry his heavy chest to his boarding house. Not to seem ignorant about the thing, though in truth he was entirely so, concerning the precise way in which to manage the barrow. Queequeg puts his chest upon it, lashes it fast, and then shoulders the barrow and marches up the wharf. Why, said I, Queequeg, you might have known better than that, one would think. Didn't the people laugh? Upon this, he told me another story. The people of his island of Rocavolco, it seems, at their wedding feasts, expressed the fragrant water of young coconuts into a large stained calabash, like a punch bowl. And this punch bowl always forms the great central ornament on the braided net, where the feast is held. Now, a certain grand merchant ship once touched at Rocavolco, and its commander, from all accounts, a very stately, punctilious gentleman, at least for a sea captain. This commander was invited to the wedding feast of Queequeg's sister, a pretty young princess, just turned of 10. Well, when all the wedding guests, which were assembled at the bride's bamboo cottage, this captain marches in, being assigned to the post of honor, placed himself over against the punch bowl, in between the high priest and his majesty Queequeg's father. Grace being said, for those people have their grace as well as we. The Queequeg told me that, unlike us, who at such times look downwards to our platters, they, on the contrary, copying the ducks, glance upwards to the great giver of all feasts. Grace, I say, being said, the high priest opens the banquet by the immemorial ceremony of the island. That is, dipping his consecrated and consecrating fingers into the bowl before the blessed beverage circulates. Seeing himself placed next the priest, and noting the ceremony, and thinking himself being captain of a ship, as having claimed precedence over a mere island king, especially in the king's own house, the captain coolly proceed to wash his bowl, taking it, I suppose, for a huge finger glass. Now, said Queequeg, what you think now? Didn't our people laugh, right? At last passage paid, and luggage safe, we stood on board the schooner, after hoisting sail, glided down the Acushnet River. On one side, New Bedford, rows and terraces of streets, their ice-covered trees, all glittering in a clear, cold air. Huge hills and mountains of casks on casks were piled upon her wharves, and side by side the wandering whale ships lay silent and safely moored at last, while from others came a sound of carpenters and coopers, with blended noises of fires and forges to melt the pitch, all betokening that new cruises were on the start. That one most perilous and long voyage ended a second, and a second ended only begins a third, and so on, forever and for aye. Such is the endlessness, yea, the intolerableness of all earthly effort. Gaining the more open water, the bracing waxed fresh. The little moss tossed the quick foam from her bows as a young colt his snortings. How I snuffed that Tartar air, how I spurned that turnpike earth, that common highway, all over dented with the marks of slavish heels and hoofs, and turned me to admire the magnanimity of the sea, which will permit no records. At the same foam fountain, Queequeg seemed to drink and reel with me. His dusky nostrils swelled apart. He showed his filed and pointed teeth. On, he flew, and our all thing gained. The moss did homage to the blast, ducked and dived her bows as a slave before the Sultan. Sideways leaning, we sideways darted, every rope yarn tingling like a wire, the two tall masts buckling like Indian canes in land tornado. So full of this reeling scene were we, as we stood by the plunging bowsprit, that for some time we did not notice the jeering glances of the passenger, a lover-like assembly, who marveled that two fellow beings should be so companionable, as though a white man were anything more dignified than a whitewashed man. But there were some boobies and bumpkins there, who by their intense greenness must have come from the heart and center of all virtue. Queequeg caught one of these young saplings, mimicking him behind his back. I felt the bumpkin's hour of doom was come. Dropping his harpoon, the brawny savage caught him in his arms, and by an almost miraculous dexterity and strength, sent him high up bodily. Then slightly tapping his stern in mid-somerset, the fellow landed with bursting lungs upon his feet, while Queequeg, turning his back upon him, lighted his tomahawk pipe and passed it. Captain, yelled the bumpkin running towards that office. Captain, here's the devil. Hello, you, sir, cried the captain, a gaunt rib of the sea, stalking up to Queequeg. What in thunder do you mean by that? Don't you know you might have killed that chap? What him say? Said keen Queequeg, as he mildly turned to me. He said I, that you came near Killy, that man there, pointing to the still shivering Killy, cried Queequeg, twisting his tattooed face into an unearthly expression of disdain. Ah, him beddy small e fishy. Queequeg no Killy, so smally fishy. Queequeg Killy, big whale. Look you, roared the captain. I'll kill you, said, you cannibal, if you try any more of your tricks aboard here. So mind your eye. But it so happened just then that it was high time for the captain to mind his own eye. The prodigious strain upon the mainsail had parted the weather sheet, and the tremendous boom was now flying from side to side, completely sweeping the entire after part of the deck. The poor fellow Pequod had handled so roughly was swept overboard. All hands were in a panic, and to attempt snatching at the boom to stay it seemed madness. It flew from right to left and back again, almost in one ticking, and every instant seemed on the point of snapping into splinters. Nothing was done, and nothing seemed capable of being done. Those on deck rushed towards the bows and stood eyeing them as if it were the lower jaw of an exasperated whale. In the midst of this consternation, Pequod dropped deftly to his knee and, crawling under the path of the boat, whipped hold of a rope, secured one end to the bulwarks, and then, flinging the other like a lasso, caught it round the boom as it swept over his head, and at the next jerk the spar was that way trapped, and all was safe. The schooner was run into the wind, and while the hands were clearing away the stern boat, Pequod, stripped to the waist, darted from the side with a long living arc. For 3 minutes or more he was seen swimming like a dog, throwing his long arms straight out before him, and by turns revealing his brawny shoulders through the freezing foam. I looked at the grand and glorious fellow, but saw no one to be saved. The greenhorn had gone down, shooting himself perpendicularly from the water. Pequod now took an instant's glance around him, and seeming to see just how matters were, dived down and disappeared. A few minutes more, and he rose again, one arm still striking out, and with the other dragging a lifeless form. The boat soon picked them up. The poor bumpkin was restored. All hands loaded Pequod a noble triumph. The captain begged his pardon. From that hour I clove to Pequod like a barnacle. Yea, till poor Pequod took his last long dive. Was there ever such unconsciousness? He did not seem to think that he at all deserved a medal from the Humane and Magnanimous Society. He only asked for water, fresh water, something to wipe the brine off. That done, he put on dry clothes, lighted his pipe, and leaning against the bulwarks, and mildly eyeing those around him, seemed to be saying to himself, "It's a mutual, joint stock world in all meridians. We cannibals must help these Christians." Chapter 14. Nothing more happened on the passage worthy the mentioning. So after a fine run, we safely arrived in Nantucket. Nantucket, take out your map and look at it. See what a real corner of the world it occupies. How it stands there, away offshore, more lonely than the Eddystone Lighthouse. Look at it. A mere hillock, an elbow of sand, all beach, without a background. There's more sand there than you would use in 20 years as a substitute for blotting paper. Some gamsome whites will tell you that they have to plant weeds there. They don't grow naturally, that they import Canada thistles, that they have to send beyond seas for a spile to stop a leak in an oil cask. That pieces of wood in Nantucket are carried about like bits of the true cross in Rome. But people there plant toadstools before their houses to get under the shade in summertime. That one blade of grass makes an oasis, 3 blades in a day's walk, a prairie. That they wear quicksand shoes, something like Laplanders' snowshoes. That they are so shut up, belted about every way enclosed, surrounded, and made an utter island by the ocean, that to their very chairs and tables, small clams will sometimes be found adhering as to the backs of sea turtles. But these extravaganzas only show that Nantucket is no Illinois. Look now at the wondrous traditional story of how this island was settled by the red men. Thus goes the legend. In olden times, an eagle swooped down upon the New England coast and carried off an infant Indian in his talons. With loud lament, the parents saw their child born out of sight over the wide waters. They resolved to follow in the same direction. Setting out in their canoes, after a perilous passage, they discovered the island, and there they found an empty ivory casket. The poor little Indian skeleton. What wonder then that these Nantucketers, born on a beach, should take to the sea for a livelihood. They first caught crabs and quahogs in the sand. Round boulder, they waded out with nets for mackerel. More experienced, they pushed off in boats and captured cod. And at last, launching a navy of great ships on the sea, explored this watery, put an incessant belt of circumnavigations round it, peeped in at Bering Straits, and in all seasons and all oceans declared everlasting war with the mightiest animated mass that has survived the flood. Most monstrous and most mountainous, that Himalayan salt sea mastodon, clothed with such portentousness of unconscious tower, that his very panics are more to be dreaded than his most fearless and malicious assaults. And thus have these naked Nantucketers, these sea hermits, issuing from their anthill in the sea, overrun and conquered the watery world, like so many Alexanders, parceling out among them the Atlantic, Pacific, as the three pirate powers. Let America add Mexico to Texas, and pile Cuba upon Canada. Let the English overswarm all India, and hang out their blazing banner from the sun. 2/3 of this terraqueous globe are the Nantucketers, for the sea is his. He owns it, as emperors own empires. Other seamen, having but a right of way through it, merchant ships, are but extension bridges. Armed ones, but floating forts. Even pirates and privateers, though following the sea as highwaymen the road, they beplunder other ships, other fragments of the land like themselves, without seeking to draw their living from the bottomless deep itself. The Nantucketer, he alone, resides and riots on the sea. He alone, in Bible language, goes down to it in ships, to and fro, plowing it as his own special plantation. There is his home. There lies his business, which a Noah's flood would not interrupt, though it overwhelmed all the millions in China. He lives on the sea as prairie copse in the prairie. He hides among the waves. He climbs them as chamois hunters climb the Alps. For years, he knows not the land, so that when he comes to it at last, it smells like another world, more strangely than the moon would to an earthsman. If the landless go, that at sunset folds her wing, and is rocked to sleep between billows. So at nightfall, the Nantucketer, out of sight of land, furls his sails and lays to his rest, while under his very pillow rush herds of walruses. Chapter 15. It was quite late in the evening when the little Moss came snugly to anchor, and Queequeg and I went ashore. So we could attend to no business that day, at least none but a supper and a bed. The landlord of the Spouter Inn had recommended us to his cousin, Hosea Hussey of the Tripods, whom he asserted to be the proprietor of one of the best-kept hotels in all Nantucket. And moreover, he had assured us that Cousin Hosea, as he called him, was famous for his chowders. In short, he plainly hinted that we could not possibly do better than try potluck at the Tripods. But the directions he had given us about keeping a yellow warehouse on our starboard hand till we opened a white church to the larboard, and then keeping that on the larboard hand till we made a corner, 3 points to the starboard, and that done, then asked the first man we met where the place was. These crooked directions of his very much puzzled us at first, especially as at the outset Queequeg insisted that the yellow warehouse. Our first point of departure must be left on the larboard, whereas I had understood Peter Coffin to say it was on the starboard. However, by dint of beating about a little in the dark, and now and then knocking up a peaceable inhabitant to inquire the way, he at last came to something which there was no mistaking. 2 enormous wooden pots painted black, and suspended by asses' ears, swung from the crosstrees of an old topmast, planted in front of an old doorway. The horns of the crosstrees were sawed off on the other sides, and top mass looked not a little like a gallows. Perhaps I was oversensitive to such impressions at the time, but I could not help staring at this gallows with a vague misgiving. A sort of crick was in my neck as I gazed up to the two remaining horns. Yes, two of them, one for Queequeg and one for me. It's ominous, thinks I. A cop and my innkeeper upon landing in my first whaling. Tombstones staring at me in the whaleman's chapel. And here, a gallows, and a pair of prodigious black pots, too. Are these last throwing out oblique hint touching Tophet? I was called from these reflections by the sight of a freckled woman with yellow hair and a yellow gown, standing in the porch of the inn, under a dull red lamp swinging there, that looked much like an injured eye, and carrying on a brisk scolding with a man in a purple woolen shirt. Get along with ye, said she to the I'll be combing, Queequeg, said I. All right. There's Mrs. Hussey. And so it turned out, Mr. Hosea Hussey being from home, but leaving Mrs. Hussey entirely competent to attend to all his affairs. Upon making known our desires for a supper and a bed, Mrs. Hussey, postponing further scolding for the present, ushered us in the little room, and seated us at a table spread with the relics of a recently concluded repast, turned round to us and said, Clam, or cod. What's that about, cods, madam? Said I, with much politeness. Clam are cod. She repeated, A clam for supper? A cold clam. Is that what you mean, Mrs. Hussey? Says I, but that's a rather cold and clammy reception in the winter time, Mrs. Hussey. But being in a great hurry to resume scolding the man in the purple shirt, who was waiting for it in the entry and seeming to hear nothing but the word clam, Mrs. Hussey hurried towards an open door leading to the kitchen, and bawling out clam for two, disappeared. Queequeg, said I, do you think that we can make out a supper for us, both on one clam? However, warm savory steam from the kitchen served to belie the apparently cheerless prospect before us. But when that smoking chowder came in, the mystery was delightfully explained. Oh, sweet friends! So hearken to me. It was made of small, juicy clams, scarcely bigger than hazelnuts, mixed with pounded shit biscuit and salted pork cut up into little flakes. The whole enriched with butter and plentifully seasoned with pepper and salt. Our appetites being sharpened by the frosty voyage, and in particular, Queequeg seeing his favorite fish and food before him, and the chowder being surpassingly excellent. We dispatched it with great expedition, when leaning back a moment, and bethinking me of Mrs. Hussey's clam and cod announcement, I thought I would try a little experiment. Stepping to the kitchen door, I uttered the word cod with great emphasis in my seat. In a few moments, the savory steam came forth again, but with a different flavor, and in good time a fine cod chowder was placed before us. We resumed to business, and while Bliner spoons in the bowl, thinks to myself, I wonder now if this here has any effect on the head. What's that stultifying saying about chowder-headed people? But look, Queequeg, ain't that a live eel in your bowl? Where's your harpoon? Fishiest of all fishy places was the try-pots, which well deserved its name. For the pots, there were always boiling chowders, chowder for breakfast, and chowder for supper, till you began to look for fish bones coming through your clothes. The area before the house was paved with clamshells. Mrs. Hussey wore a polished necklace of codfish vertebra, and Hosea Hussey had his account books bound in superior shark skin. There was a fishy flavor to the milk, too, which I could not at all account for, till one morning happening along some fish. I saw Hosea's brindled cow feeding on fish remnants and marching along the sand with each foot, and a cod's decapitated head, looking very slipshod. Supper concluded, we received a lamp and directions from Mrs. Hussey concerning the nearest way to bed. But as Queequeg was about to get the stairs, the lady raised her arm and demanded his harpoon. She allowed no harpoon in her chamber. Why not? Said I. Every true whaleman sleeps with his harpoon, but why not? Because it's dangerous, says she. Ever since young Stiggs, coming from that unfortunate voyage of his, he was gone 4 years and a half. With only 3 barrels of Isle was found dead in my first 4 back with his harpoon. Ever since then, I allowed no boarders to take sick, dangerous weapons in their rooms at night. So, Mr. Queequeg, for she had learned his name, I will just take this here iron and keep it for you. But the chowder, clam or cod tomorrow for breakfast, men. Both, says. And let's have a couple of smoked herring by way of variety. Chapter 16. In bed, we concocted our plans for the morrow. But to my surprise and no small concern, Queequeg now gave me to understand that he had been diligently consulting Yoho, the name of his black little god, and Yoho had told him 2 or 3 times over, and strongly insisted upon it everywhere, that instead of our going together among the whaling fleet in harbor, and in concert selecting our craft, instead of this, I say, Yojo earnestly enjoined that the selection of the ship should rest wholly with me, inasmuch as Yojo purposed befriending us, and in order to do so, had already pitched upon a vessel. If left to myself, I, Ishmael, should infallibly light upon, for all the world, as though it had turned out by chance. And in that vessel, I must immediately ship myself, for the present, irrespective of Queequeg. I have forgotten to mention that, in many things, Queequeg placed great confidence in the excellence of Yoho's judgment and surprising forecast of things, and cherished Yojo with considerable esteem as a rather good sort of god, who perhaps meant well enough upon the whole, but in all cases did not succeed in his benevolent design. Now this plan of Queequeg's, or rather Yojo's, touching the selection of our craft, I did not like that plan at all. I had not a little relied upon Queequeg's sagacity to point out the whaler best fitted to carry us and our fortunes securely. But as all my remonstrances produced no effect upon Queequeg, I was obliged to acquiesce, and accordingly prepared to set about this business with a determined, rushing sort of energy that should quickly settle that trifling. Next morning early, leaving Queequeg shut up with Yojo in our little bedroom, for it seemed that it was some sort of Lent or Ramadan or day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer with Queequeg and Yojo that day. How it was I never could find out, for though I applied myself to it several times, I never could master his liturgy. Even Queequeg, then, fasting on his tomahawk, and Yoho himself at his sacrificial fire, I sallied out. After much prolonged sauntering and many random inquiries, I learnt that there were 3 ships up for 3 years' voyages. The Devil Dam, the Titbit, and the Pequod. Devil Dam I do not know the origin of. Titbit is obvious. Pequod, you will no doubt remember, was the name of the celebrated tribe of Massachusetts, now extinct as the ancient Medes. I peered and pried about the Devil Dam. From her hopped over to the Titbit, and finally, going on board the Pequod, looked around her for a moment, and then decided that this was the very ship for us. You may have seen many a quaint craft in your day. For aught I know, square-toed luggers, mountainous Japanese junks, butterbox galliots. But take my word for it, you never saw such a rare old craft as this same rare old Pequod. She was a ship of the old school, rather small, if anything, with an old-fashioned, claw-footed look about her. Long-seasoned and weather-stained in the typhoons and calms of all 4 oceans, her old hull's complexion was darkened, like a French grenadier who has alike fought in Egypt and Siberia. Her venerable bows looked bearded. Her masts cut somewhere on the coast of Japan, where her original ones were lost overboard in a gale. Her mast stood stiffly up, like the spines of the 3 old of Cologne. Her ancient decks were worn and wrinkled, like the pilgrim-worshipped flagstone in Canterbury Cathedral, or Becket, fled. But to all these her old antiquities were added, and marvelous, pertaining to the wild business that for more than half a century had followed. old Captain Peleg, many years her chief mate, before he commanded another vessel of his own, and now a retired seaman and one of the principal owners of the Pequod. This old Peleg, during the term of his chief mateship, had built upon her original grotesqueness and inlaid it all over with a quaintness both of material and device unmatched by anything except it be Thor Kilhake's carved buckler or bedstead. She was apparelled like any barbaric Ethiopian emperor, his neck heavy with pendants of polished ivory. She was a thing of trophies, a cannibal of a craft, tricking herself forth in the chased bones of her enemies. All round, her uncanaled open bulwarks were garnished like one continuous jaw, with the long sharp teeth of the sperm whale inserted there for pins to fasten her old hempen thaws into. Those thaws ran not through base blocks of lantwood, but deftly traveled over sheets of sea ivory. Scorning a turnstile wheel at her reverend helm, she sported there a tiller, and that tiller was in one mass, curiously carved from the long, narrow lower jaw of her hereditary foe. The helmsman steered by that tiller felt like the Tartar who holds back his fiery steed by clutching its jaw. A noble craft, but somehow a most melancholy. All noble things are touched with it. Now, when I looked about the quarterdeck for someone having authority in order to propose myself as a candidate for the voyage, at first I saw nobody, but I could not well overlook a strange sort of rather pitched a little behind mast. It seemed only a temporary erection used in port. It was of a conical shape, some 10 feet high, consisting of the long, huge slabs of limber black bone taken from the middle and highest part of the jaws of the right whale. Planted with their broad ends on the deck, a circle of these slabs laced together, mutually sloped towards each other, and at the apex united in a tufted point, where the loose hairy fibers waved to and for like the topknot on some old Potawatomi Sockum's head. A triangular opening faced toward the bows of the ship, so that the insider commanded a complete forward. And half concealed in this queer tent, I at length found one, by his aspect, seemed to have authority, and who, it being noon, and the ship's work suspended, was now enjoying respite from the burden of... He was seated on an old-fashioned oaken chair, wrinkling all over with curious carving, and the bottom of which was formed of a stout interlacing of the same elastic stuff of which the wigwam was constructed. There was nothing so very particular, perhaps, about the appearance of the elderly man I saw. He was brown and brawny, like most old seamen, and heavily rolled up in blue pilot cloth, cut in the Quaker style. Only there was a fine and almost microscopic network of the thinnest wrinkles interlacing round his eyes, which must have arisen from his continual sailings in many hard gales, and always looking to windward. For this causes the muscles about the eyes to become pursed together. Such eye wrinkles are very effectual in a scowl. "Is this the captain of the Pequod?" said I, advancing to the door of the tent. "Supposing it be the captain of the Pequod, what dost thou want of him?" he demanded. "I was thinking of shipping." "Thou was wise thou? I see thou art no Nantucketer. Ever been in a stove boat?" "No, sir, I never have." "Dost know nothing at all about whaling, I dare say?" "Nothing, sir, but I have no doubt I shall. I've been several voyages in the merchant service, and I think that..." "Merchant service be damned. Talk not that lingo to me. Does thou see that leg? I'll take that leg away from thy stern. If ever thou talkest of the marchand service to me, then one of a C.H.'s selves is particular by I suppose now ye feel considerable proud of having served in those martial ships. But flukes! What makes thee want to go reeling? Ah, it looks a little suspicious, don't it? Has not been a pirate, hast thou? Didst not rob thy last captain? Didst thou? Dost not think of murdering the officers when thou gettest to sea? I protested my innocence of these things. I saw that under the mask of these half-humorous innuendos, this old seaman, as an insulated Quakerish Nantucketer, was full of his insular prejudice, and rather distrustful of all aliens, unless they hailed from Cape Cod or the Vineyard. But what takes thee a whaling? I want to know that before I think of shipping ya. Oh, sir, I want to see what whaling is. I want to see the world. Want to see what whaling is. Huh? Have you clapped eye on Captain Ahab? Who's Captain Ahab? Aye, I thought so. Captain Ahab is the captain of this ship. I am mistaken, then? I thought I was speaking to the captain himself. Thou art speaking to Captain Peleg. That's who you're speaking to, young man. That belongs to me and Captain Bildad, to see the Pequod fitted out for the voyage and supplied with all her needs, including crew. We are part owners and agents, but as I was going to say, if thou wantest to know what whaling is, as thou tellest to do, I can put you in a way of finding it out before you bind yourself to it past backing out. Clap eye on Captain Ahab, and thou wilt find that he has only leg. What do you mean, sir? Was the other one lost by a whale? Lost by a whale. Young man, come near to me, was devoured, chewed up, crunched by the monstrous pharmacist that ever chipped the boat. I was a little alarmed by his energy, perhaps also a little touched at the hearty in his concluding exclamation, but said as calmly as it could, "What you say is no doubt true enough, sir. But how could I know there was any peculiar ferocity in that particular? No, indeed, I might have inferred as much from the simple fact of the accident. Look you now, young man, thy lungs are a sort of soft, do you see? Thou dost not talk shark a bit. Sure, you've been to sea before now. Sure of that." "Sir," said I thought I told you that I had been 4 voyages in the merchant. Hard down on me. Mind what I said about the marchand service. Don't aggravate me. I won't have it. But let us understand each other. I have given thee a hint about what whaling is. Do ye yet feel inclined for it? I do, sir. Very good. Now, art thou the man to pitch a harpoon down a live roe's throat, and then jump after it? Answer. Quick. I am, sir, if it should be positively indispensable to do so. Not to be got rid of, that is. I don't take to be good again. Now then, thou not only wantest to go a whale to find out by experience what whaling is, but ye also to go to see the wood. Was not that what ye said? I thought so. Well then, just step forward there and take a peep over the weather, and then back to me and tell me what you see there. For a moment, I stood a little puzzled by this curious request, not knowing exactly how to take it, whether humorously or in earnest. But concentrating all his crow's feet into one scowl, Captain Peleg started me on the errand. Going forward and glancing over the weather bow, I perceived that the ship swinging to her anchor with the flood tide was now obliquely pointing towards the open ocean. The prospect was unlimited, but exceedingly monotonous and forbidding. Not the slightest variety that I could see. "Well, what's the report?" said Peleg when I came back. "What did you see?" "Not much," I replied. "Nothing but water. Considerable horizon, and there's a squall coming up. What does thou think, then, of seeing the world? Do you wish to go round Cape Horn to see any more of it, eh? Can't ye see the world where you stand?" I was a little staggered, but go a-whaling I must, I would. And the Pequod was as good a ship as any. I thought the best. And all this I now repeated to Peleg. Seeing me so determined, he expressed his willingness to ship me. "And thou mayest as well sign the papers right off," he added. "Come along." And so saying, he led the way below deck into the cabin. Seated on the transom was what seemed to me a most uncommon and surprising figure. It turned out to be Captain Bildad, who along with Captain Peleg was one of the largest owners of the vessel. The other shares, as is sometimes the case in these ports, being held by a crowd of old annuitants, widows, fatherless children, and chancery ones, each owning about the value of a timberhead, or a foot of plank, or a nail or two in the ship. People in Nantucket invest their money in whaling vessels, the same way that you do yours, state stocks, bringing in good and... Now Bildad, like Peleg, and indeed many other Nantucketers, was a Quaker, the island having been originally settled by that sect. And to this day, its inhabitants in general retain in an uncommon measure the peculiarities of the Quaker, only variously and anomalously modified by things altogether alien and heterogeneous. For some of these same Quakers are the most sanguinary of all sailors and were-hunters. They are fighting Quakers. They are Quakers with a vengeance. So that there are instances among them of men who named with scripture name, a singularly common fashion on the island, and in childhood naturally imbibing the stately, dramatic thee, and now of the Quaker turning in. Still, from the audacious, daring, and boundless adventure of their subsequent lives, strangely blend these unoutgrown peculiarities. 1,000 bold dashes of character, not unworthy a Scandinavian sea king or a poetical pagan Rome. And when these things unite in a man of greatly superior natural force, with a globular brain and a ponderous heart, who has also by the stillness and seclusion of many long night watches waters, and beneath constellation that led to think untraditional, receiving all nature's sweet or savage impression fresh from her own virgin, voluntary and confiding breasts, and thereby chiefly, but with some help from accidental advantages, to learn a bold and nervous, lofty that man makes one in a whole nation's census, a mighty pageant creature, formed for noble tragedies, nor will it at all detract from him dramatically regarded, if either by birth or other circumstances he have what seems a half-willful, overruling morbidness at the bottom of his... For all men, tragically great, are made so, through a certain morbidness. Be sure of this, O young ambition, all mortal greatness is but disease. But as yet, we have not to do with such an one, but with quite another, and still a man who, if indeed peculiar, it only results again from another phase of the Quaker, modified by individual circumstances. Like Captain Peleg, Captain Bildad was a well-to-do, retired whaleman. But unlike Captain Peleg, who cared not a rush for what are called serious things, and indeed deemed those self-same serious things the veriest of all trifles, Captain Bildad had not only been originally educated according to the strictest sect of Nantucket Quakerism, all his subsequent ocean life, and the sight of many unplaid, lovely island round, all that had not moved this native-born Quaker one single jot, had not so much as altered one angle of his vest. Still, for all the immutableness, was there some lack of common consistency about worthy Captain Bildad, though refusing from conscientious scruples to bear arms against land invaders, yet himself had illimitably invaded Pacific. And though a sworn foe to human bloodshed, yet had he in his straight-bodied coat spilled tons upon tons of Leviathan gore. How now, in the contemplative eve of his days, the pious Bildad reconciled these things in the reminiscence, they do not know, but it did not seem to concern him much, and very probably he had long since come to the sage and sensible conclusion that a man is one thing, and his practical world quite another. This world pays dividends, rising from a little cabin in short clothes of the drabbest drab, to a harpooner and a broad shad-bellied waistcoat. From that becoming boat header, chief mate, and captain, and finally a ship owner. Bildad, as I hinted before, had concluded his adventurous career by wholly retiring from active life at the goodly age of 60, and dedicating his remaining days to the quiet receiving of his well-earned income. Now, Bildad, I am sorry to say, had the reputation of being an incorrigible old hunks, and in his seagoing days, a bitter, hard taskmaster. They told me in Nantucket, though it certainly seems a curious story, that when he sailed the old Cattegat whale, his crew, upon arriving home, were mostly all carried ashore to the hospital, sore exhausted and worn. For a pious man, especially for a Quaker, he was certainly rather hard-hearted, to say the least. He never used to swear, though, at his men, they said, But somehow he got an inordinate quantity of cruel, unmitigated hard work out of them. When Bildad was a chief mate, to have his drab-colored eye intently looking made you feel completely nervous till you could clutch something, a hammer or a marling spike, and go to work, like mad, at something or other, never mind what. Indolence and idleness perished before him. His own person was the exact embodiment of his utilitarian character. On his long, gaunt body, he carried no spare flesh, no superfluous beard, his chin having a soft, economical nap to it, like the worn nap of his broad-brimmed hat. Such, then, was the person that I saw seated on the transom when I followed Captain Peleg down into the cabin. The space between the decks was small, and there, bolt upright, sat old Bildad, who always sat so and never wept, and this to save his coat-tails. His broad brim was placed beside him. His legs were stiffly crossed. His drab vesture was buttoned up to his chin, and spectacles on nose, he seemed absorbed in reading from a ponderous volume. "Bildad," cried Captain Peleg. At it again, Bildad, eh? You know, the ways had been giving was experienced 20 years. You lived back in when I came. How far you got, Bildad? As if long habituated to such profane talk from his old shipmate Bildad, without noticing his present irreverence, quietly, and seeing me, glanced again, inquiringly, towards Peleg. "He says he's our man, Bildad," said Peleg. "He wants to ship." "Does he?" I said, Bildad, in a hollow tone, and turning round to me. "I dust," said I unconsciously. He was so intense, a Quaker. "What do you think of him, Bildad?" said Peleg. "He'll do," said Bildad. "I'm me," and then went on spelling away at his book in a mumbling tone, quite audible. I thought him the queerest old Quaker I ever saw, especially as Peleg, his friend, an old shipmate, seemed such a bluster, but I said nothing, only looking round me sharply. Peleg now threw open a chest, and drawing forth the ship's articles, placed pen and ink before him, and seated himself at a little table. I began to think it was high time to settle with myself at what terms I would be to engage for the voyage. I was already aware that in the whaling business there'd be no wages, but all hands, including the captain, received certain shares of the profits called lays, and that these lays were proportioned to the degree of importance pertaining to the respective duties of the ship's company. I was also aware that being a green hand at whaling, my own lay would not be very large, but considering that I was used to the sea, could steer a ship, splice a rope, and all that, I made no doubt that from all I had heard I should be offered at least the 275th lay. That is, the 275th part of the clear net proceeds of the voyage, whatever that might eventually amount to. And though the 275th lay was what they call a rather long lay, yet it was better than nothing. And if we had a lucky voyage, might pretty nearly pay for the clothing I would wear out on it, not to speak of my 3 years' beef and board, for which I would not have to pay 1 stiver. It might be thought that this was a poor way to accumulate a princely fortune, and so it was, a very poor way indeed. But I'm one of those that never take on about princely fortune, and I'm quite content if the world is ready to board and lodge me, while I'm putting up at this grim sign of the thundercloud. Upon the whole, I thought that the 275th lay would be about the fair thing, but would not have been surprised had I been offered the 200th, considering I was of a broad-shouldered knit. But one thing, nevertheless, that made me a little distrustful about receiving a generous share of the profits was this. Ashore, I had heard something of both Captain Peleg, his unaccountable old crony, Bildad. How that they being the principal proprietors of the Pequod, therefore the other and more inconsiderable and scattered owners, left nearly the whole management of the ship's affairs to these two. And I did not know but what the stingy old Bildad might have a mighty deal to say about shipping hands, especially as I now found him on board Pequod, quite at home there in the cabin, and reading his Bible as if at his own fireside. Now while Peleg was vainly trying to mend a pen with his jackknife, old Bedad, to my no small surprise, considering that he was such an interested party in these proceedings, Bildad never heeded us, but went on mumbling to himself out of his book, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth where moth." "Well, Captain Bildad," interrupted Peleg, "what you say? What relation thou knowest best," was the sepulchral reply. "The 777th wouldn't be too much, would it? Where moth and rust do corrupt, but lay, indeed, thought I, and such a lay. The 777th. Well, old Bildad, you are determined that I, for one, shall not lay up any lays here below, where moth and rust do corrupt." It was an exceedingly long lay, that indeed, and though from the magnitude of the figure, it might at first deceive a landsman, yet the slightest consideration will show that those 777 is a pretty large number. Yet when you come to make a problem, you will then see. And I say that the 777th part of a farthing is a good deal less than 777 gold doubloons. And so I thought at the time, why? "Bless your eyes, Bildad," cried Peleg, "there does not want to swindle this. He must have more than that." 777th, again said Bildad, without lifting his eyes, and then went on, mumbling, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart also." "I'm going to put him down for the 300, said Peleg. "Do you hear that, Bildad? The 300th lay, I say." Bildad laid down his book, and turning solemnly towards him said, "Captain Peleg, thou hast a generous heart, but thou must consider the duty thou owest to the other owners, widows and orphans, many of them, and that if we too abundantly reward the labors of this young man, we may be taking the bread from those widows and those orphans." The 777th lay, Captain Peleg. "Thou, Bildad," roared Peleg, starting up and clattering about the cabin. "Alas ye, Captain Bildad, if I had followed thy advice in these matters, I would afore now had a conscience to lug about, that would be heavy enough to founder the largest ship that ever sailed round Cape Horn." "Captain Peleg," said Bildad steadily, "thy conscience may be drawing 10 inches of water, or 10 fathoms. I can't tell. But as thou art still an impenitent, Captain Peleg, I greatly fear lest, and will in the end sink thee foundering down to the fiery pit. Ye insult me, man. Past all natural bearing, insult me. It's an all-fired outrage to tell any human creature that he's bound to hell. Flukes and flames. Bildad, say that again to me, and start my soul bolts. But yes, I'll swallow a live goat with all his hair and horns on. Out of the cabin, he canting, drab-colored son of a wooden gun, a straight wake as he thundered out, as he made a rush at Bildad, but with a marvelous sliding celerity. Bildad for that time eluded him, alarmed at this terrible outburst between the two principal and responsible owners of the ship, and feeling half a mind to give up all idea of sailing in a vessel so questionably owned and temporarily commanded. I stepped aside from the door to give egress to Bildad, who, I made no doubt, was all eagerness to vanish from before the awakened wrath of Peleg. But to my astonishment, he sat down again on the transom very quietly, and seemed to have not the slightest intention of withdrawing. He seemed quite used to impenitent Peleg in his ways. As for Peleg, after letting off his rage as he had, there seemed no more left in him, and he too sat down like a lamb, though he twitched a little, as if still nervously agitated. "Whew!" he whistled at last. "His squall's gone off to leeward, I think. Bildad, thou used to be good at sharpening a lance. Mend that pen." Yeah. "My jackknife here needs the grindstone." "That's he." "Thank ye, Bildad. Now then, my young man, Ishmael's thy name. Didn't ye say? Well then down, you go here, Ishmael, for the 300 flay. Captain Peleg said, I have a friend with me who wants to ship too. Shall I bring him down tomorrow? To be sure, said Peleg. Fetch him along, and we'll look at him. What lay does he want? Groaned Bildad, glancing up from the book, in which he had again been burying himself. Oh, never the be mind about that, Bildad said Peleg. Has he ever whaled at any? Turning to me, killed more whales than I can count, Captain Peleg. Well, bring them along then. And after signing the papers, off I went, nothing doubting but that I had done a good morning's work, and that the Pequod was the identical ship that Yojo had provided to carry Queequeg and me round the Cape. But I had not proceeded far when I began to be thinking that the captain with whom I was to sail yet remained unseen. Though indeed, in many cases, a whale ship would be completely fitted out and receive all her crew on board, ere the captain makes himself visible by arriving to take command. The problem of the setting voyages are so prolonged, and the short intervals at home so exceeding, that if the captain have a family or any of that sort, he does not trouble himself much about his ship in port, but leaves her to the owners till all is ready for sea. However, it is always as well to have a look at him before irrevocably committing yourself. So, turning back, I accosted Captain, inquiring where Captain Ahab was to. And what dost thou want of Captain? It's all right enough. Thou art shipped. Yes, and I should like to see him, but I don't think thou wilt be able to at present. I don't know exactly what's the matter with him, but he keeps close inside the house, a sort of sick, and yet he don't look so. In fact, he aren't sick, but no, he isn't well either. Anyhow, young man, he won't always see me, so I don't suppose he will be. He's a queer man, Captain Ahab, so some think, but a good one. Oh, though I like him well enough. No fear, no fear. He's a grand, ungodly, godlike man, Captain Ahab. Doesn't speak much, but when he does speak, then you may well listen. Mark ye, be forewarned. Ahab's above the common. Ahab's been in colleges, as well as among the cannibals. Been used to deeper wonders than the waves. Fixed his fiery lance in mightier, stranger foes than whales. His lance, the keenest and the surest, but out of all our isle. Oh, he ain't Captain Bildad. No, and he isn't Captain Peleg. He's Ahab boy, and Ahab of old, thou knowest, was a crowned king, and a very vile one. When that wicked king was slain, the dogs, did they not lick his blood? Come hither to me. Hither, hither, said Peleg, with a significance in his eye that almost startled me. Look ye, lad, never say that on board the Pequod. Never say it anywhere. Captain Ahab did not name himself. That was a foolish, ignorant whim of his crazy widowed mother, who died when he was only a 12-month-old. And yet the old squaw Tistage at Gayhead said that the name would somehow prove prophetic, and perhaps other fools like her may tell thee the same. I wish to warn thee, it's a lie. I know Captain Ahab well. I've sailed with him as mate years ago. I know what he is, a good man, not a pious good man like Bildad, but a swearing good man, something like me, only there's a good. I know that he was never very jolly, and I know that on the passage home he was a little out of his mind for a spell, but it was the shark-shooting pains in his bleeding stump that brought that about, as anyone might see. I know too that ever since he lost his leg last voyage by that accursed whale, he's been a kind of moody, desperate, moody, and savage sometimes, but that will all pass off. And once for all, let me tell thee and assure thee, young man, it's better to sail with a moody good captain than a laughing bad one. So, goodbye to thee. And wrong, not Captain Ahab, because he happens to have a wicked name. Besides, my boy, he has a wife, not 3 voyages wedded, a sweet, resigned girl. Think of that, or that sweet girl that old man as a child. Hold, then there can be any utter, hopeless harm, Ahab? No, my lad. Stricken Blasted if he be. Ahab has his humanities. And as I walked away, I was full of thoughtfulness. What had been incidentally revealed to me of Captain Ahab filled me with a certain wild vagueness concerning it. And somehow, at the time, I felt a sympathy and a sorrow for him, for I don't know what, unless it was the cruel loss of his leg. And yet I also felt a strange awe of him. But that sort of awe, which I cannot at all describe, was not exactly awe. I do not know what it was, but I felt it, and it did not disincline me towards him, though I felt impatience at what seemed like so imperfectly as he to me then. However, my thoughts were at length carried in other directions, so that for the present dark Ahab slipped my mind. Chapter 17. As Queequeg's Ramadan, or fasting and humiliation, was to continue all day, I did not choose to disturb him till towards nightfall, for I cherished the greatest respect towards everybody's religious obligations, never mind how comical, and could not find it in my heart to undervalue even a congregation of ants or those other creatures in certain parts of our earth, who, with a degree of footmanism quite unprecedented in other planets, bow down before the torso of a deceased landed proprietor, merely on account of the inordinate possessions yet owned and rented. I say, we good Presbyterian Christians should be charitable in these things, and not fancy ourselves so vastly superior to other mortals, pagans and whatnot, because of their half-crazy conceits on these subjects. There was Queequeg, now certainly entertaining the most absurd about Yojo in his Ramadan. But what of that? Queequeg thought he knew what he was about, I suppose. He seemed to be content, and there let him rest. All our arguing would not avail. Let him be, I say. In heaven have mercy on us all, Presbyterians and pagans alike, for we are all somehow dreadfully cracked about the head, and sadly, towards evening, when I felt assured that all of his performances and rituals must be over, I went up to his room and knocked at the door. But no answer. I tried to open it, but it was fastened inside. Queequeg, said I softly through the keyhole, all silent. I say, Queequeg, why don't you speak? It's I, Ishmael. But all remained still as before. I began to grow alarmed. I had allowed him such abundant time. I thought he might have had an apoplectic fit. I looked through the keyhole, but the door opening into an odd corner of the keyhole prospect was but a crooked and sinister. I could only see part of the footboard of the bed and a line of the wall, but nothing more. I was surprised to behold resting against the wall the wooden shaft of Queequeg's harpoon, which the landlady the evening previous had taken from me before our mounting to the chamber. That's strange, thought I, but at any rate, since the harpoon stands yonder, and he seldom or never goes abroad without it, therefore he must be inside here, and no possible mistake. Queequeg, Queequeg, all still. Something must have happened. Lexi, I tried to burst open the door, but it stubbornly resisted. Running downstairs, I quickly stated my suspicions to the first person I met, the chambermaid. "Ah," she cried, "I thought something must be the matter. I went to make the bed after breakfast, and the door was locked, and not a mouse to be heard. And it's been just so silent ever since. But I thought maybe you had both gone off and locked your baggage in for safekeeping." La ma'am, mistress, murder, Mrs. Husson, apoplexy. And with these cries, she ran towards the kitchen, and following, Mrs. Hussey soon appeared, with a mustard pot in one hand and a vinegar cruet in the other, having just broken away from the occupation of attending to the castor, and scolding her little black boy meantime. "Which way to it? Run for God's sake, and fetch something to pry open the yaks. Yaks! He's had a stroke, depend upon it." And so saying, I was unmethodically rushing upstairs again empty-handed, when Mrs. Hussey interposed the mustard pot and vinegar cruet, and the entire castor of her countenance. "What's the matter with you, young man? Diphthiacs? For God's sake, run for the doctor. Someone will let pry it open." Look here, said the landlady, quickly putting down the vinegar cruet so as to have one hand free. Look here. Are you talking about prying open any of my doors? And with that, she seized my arm. What's the matter with you? What's the matter with you, shipmate? In as calm but rapid a manner as possible, I gave her to understand the whole. Unconsciously clapping the vinegar cruet to one side of her nose, she ruminated for an instant, then exclaimed, "No, I haven't seen it since I put it there." Running to a little closet under the landing of the stairs, she glanced in and returning, told me that Queequeg's harpoon was missing. "He's killed himself," she cried. "It's unfortunate Stig's done over again. There goes another counterpane. God pity his poor mother. It will be the ruin of my house. Has the poor lad a sister? Where's that girl? There, Betty. Go to Snarls the painter and tell him to paint me a sign, with no suicides permitted and no smoking in the parlor. Might as well kill both birds at once." Kill? The Lord be merciful. To his ghost? What's that noise there? "You, young man," avast there, and running up after me, she caught me as I was, again trying to force open the door. "I don't allow it. I won't have my premises spoiled. Go for the locksmith. There's one about a mile from here." But avast, putting her hand in her side pocket, "Here's a key. That'll fit, I guess. Let's see." And with that, she turned it in the lock. But alas! Queequeg's supplemental bolt remained unwithdrawn within. "Have to burst it open," said I, and was running down the end for a good start when the landlady caught at me. Again, vowing I should not break down her premises. But I tore from her, and with a sudden bodily rush, dashed myself full against the mark. With a prodigious noise, the door flew open, and the knob slamming against the wall sent the plaster to the ceiling. And there, good heavens, there sat Queequeg, altogether cool and self-collected, right in the middle of the room, squatting on his hams and holding Yojo on top of his head. He looked neither one way or the other way, but sat like a carved image with scarce a sign of active life. "Queequeg," said I, going up to him. "Queequeg, what's the matter with you? He hasn't been a-sitting so all day, has he?" said the landlady. But all we said, not a word could we drag out of him. I almost felt like pushing him over, so as to change his position, for it was almost intolerable. It seemed so painfully and unnaturally constrained, especially as in all probability he had been sitting so for upwards of 8 or 10 hours, going too without his regular meals. "Mrs. Hussey," said I, "he's alive, at all events. So leave us, if you please, and I will see to this strange affair myself." Closing the door upon the landlady, I endeavored to prevail upon Queequeg the chair, but in vain. There he sat, could do for my polite arts and blandishments. He would not move a peg, nor say a single word, nor even look at me, nor notice my presence in the slightest way. I wonder, thought I, if this can possibly be a part of his Ramadan. Do they fast on their hams that way, native island? It must be so. Yes, it's part of his creed, I suppose. Well, then, let him rest. He'll get up sooner or later, no doubt. It can't last forever, thank God, and his Ramadan only comes once a year. And I don't believe it's very punctual, then. I went down to supper. After sitting a long time listening to the long stories of some sailors who had just come from a plum pudding, as they called it. That is, a short whaling voyage in a schooner or brig confined to the north of the lying Atlantic Ocean. After listening to these plum puddingers till nearly 11 o'clock, I went upstairs to go to bed, feeling quite sure by this time Queequeg must certainly have brought his Ramadan to a termination. But no, there, he was just where I had left him. He had not stirred an inch. I began to grow vexed with him. It seemed so downright senseless and insane to be sitting there all day and half the night on his hands in a cold room, holding a piece of wood on his. For heaven's sake, Queequeg, get up and shake yourself. Get up and have some supper. No starve. You'll kill yourself, Pequod. But not a word did he reply. Despairing of him, therefore, I determined to go to bed and to sleep. Then no doubt, before a great while, he would follow me. But previous to turning in, I took my heavy bearskin jacket and threw it over him, as it promised to be a very cold night, and he had nothing but his ordinary round jacket on. For some time, do all I would, I could not get into the faintest doze. I had blown out the candle, and the mere thought of Pequod, not 4 feet off, sitting there in that uneasy position, stark alone in the cold and dark. This made me really wretched. Think of it, sleeping all night in the same room with a wide-awake pagan in this dreary, unaccountable. But somehow I dropped off at last, and knew nothing more till break of day, when, looking over the bedside, there squatted Pequod, as if he had been screwed down to the floor. But as soon as the first glimpse of sun entered the window, up he got, with stiff and grating joints, but with a cheerful look, limped towards me where I lay, pressed his forehead again against mine, and said his Ramadan was over. Now as I before hinted, I have no objection to any person's religion, be it what it may, so long as that person does not kill or insult any other person, because that other person don't believe it also. But when a man's religion becomes really frantic, when it is a positive torment to him, and in fine, makes this earth of ours an uncomfortable inn to lodge in, then I think it high time to take that individual aside and argue the point. And just so I now did with Pequod. Pequod, said I, get into bed now and lie and listen to me. I then went on, beginning with the rise and progress of the primitive religions and coming down to the various religions of the present time, during which time I labored to show Pequod that all these Lents, Ramadans, and prolonged ham-squattings in cold, stark, bad for the health, bad, useless for the soul, opposed, in short, to the obvious laws of hygiene and common sense. I told him, too, that he, being in other things such an extremely sensible and sagacious savage, it pained me, very badly pained me, to see him now so out of deplorably foolish about this ridiculous Ramadan of his. Besides, argued I, fasting makes the body cave. Hence the spirit caves in, and all thoughts born of a fast must necessarily be half-starved. This is the reason why most dyspeptic religionists cherish such melancholy notions about their hereafters. In one word, Pequod, said I, rather digressedly, how is an idea first born on an undigested apple dumpling, and since then perpetuated through the hereditary dyspepsias, nurtured by Ramadan? I then asked Pequod whether he himself was ever troubled with dyspepsia, expressing the idea very plainly so that he could take it in. He said no, only upon one memorable occasion. It was after a great feast given by his father on the gaining of a great battle, wherein 50 of the enemy had been killed by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all cooked and eaten but very evening. No more, Pequod, said I, shuddering. That will do, for I need the inferences without his further hint. I had seen a sailor who had visited that very island, and he told me that it was the custom, when a great battle had been gained there, to barbecue all the slain in the yard or garden of the victor, and then, one by one, they were placed in great wooden trenchers, and garnished round like a palau with breadfruit in coconut, and with some parsley in their mouths, were sent round with the victor's compliments to all his friends, just as though these presents were so many Christmas turkeys. After all, I do not think that my remarks about religion made much impression upon Cleve, because in the first place he somehow seemed dull of hearing on that important subject, unless considered from his own point of view. And in the second place, he did not more than 1/3 understand me, couch my ideas, simply as I would. And finally, he no doubt thought he knew a good deal more about the true religion than I did. He looked at me with a sort of condescending concern, as though he thought it a great pity that such a sense should be so hopelessly lost in piety. At last we rose and dressed in Queequeg, taking a prodigiously hearty breakfast of chowders of all sorts, so that the landlady should not make much profit by reason of his Ramadan. We sallied out to board the Pequod, sauntering along, picking our teeth with halibut bones. Chapter 18. As we were walking down the end of the wharf towards the ship, Queequeg, bringing his harpoon, Captain Peleg in his gruff voice loudly hailed us from, saying he had not suspected my friend was a cannibal, and furthermore announcing that he let no cannibals on board that craft, unless they previously produced their papers. "What do you mean by that, Captain Peleg?" said I, now jumping on the bulwarks and leaving my comrade standing on the wharf. "I mean," he replied, "he must show his papers." "Yes," said Captain Bildad in his hollow voice, sticking his head from behind Peleg's out of the wigwam. "He must show that he's converted. Son of darkness," he added, turning to Queequeg, "art thou at present any Christian?" "Why," said I, "he's a member of the First Congregational Church. Here be it said that many tattooed savages sailing in Nantucket ships at last come to be converted into the churches." "First Congregational Church," cried Bildad, "what?" "That worships in Deacon Deuteronomy, Holman's eating house." And so saying, taking out his spectacles, he rubbed them with his great yellow bandana handkerchief, and putting them on very carefully, came out of the wigwam, and leaning stiffly over the bulwarks, took a good long look at Queequeg. "How long have we been a member?" He then said, turning to me, "Not very long, I rather guess. Man." "No," said Peleg, "and he hasn't been baptized, right, either, or it would have washed some of that devil's blue off his face." "Do tell, now," cried Bildad. "Is this Philistine a regular member of Deacon Deuteronomy?" "I never saw him going there, and I pass it every Lord's Day. I don't know anything about Deacon Deuteronomy or his meaning," said I. "All I know is that Queequeg here is a born member of the First Congregational Church. He is a deacon himself. Queequeg is." "Young man," said Bildad sternly, "thou art skylarking with—" "Explain thyself, thou young Hittite. What church dost thee mean? Answer me." Finding myself thus hard pushed, I replied, "I mean, sir, the same ancient Catholic church to which you and I, and Captain Peleg there, and Queequeg here, and all of us, and every mother's son and soul of us belong. The great and everlasting First Congregation of this whole worshiping world. We all belong to that. Only some of us cherished some queer crotchets, no ways touching the grand belief. In that, we all join hands." "Splice, thou meanest, splice hands," cried Peleg, drawing nearer. "Young man, you'd better ship for a missionary, instead of a foremast. I never heard a better sermon. Deacon Deuteronomy, why Father Napple himself couldn't he's reckoned something. Come aboard, come aboard. Never mind about the papers. I say, tell Quahog there. What's that you call him? Tell Quahog to step along. By the great anchor, what harpoon he's got there. Looks like good stuff. That. And he handles it about right. I say, Quahog, or whatever you're... Did you ever stand in the head of a whaleboat? Did you ever strike a fish? Without saying a word, Queequeg, in his wild sort of way, jumped upon the bulwarks, from thence into the bows of one of the whaleboats, hanging to the side, and embracing his left knee and poising his harpoon, cried out in some such way as this: "Captain, you see him small drop tar on water there. You see him? Well, suppose him one whale eye. Well, then, taking sharp aim at it, he darted the iron right over old Bildad's broad brim, clean across the ship's decks, and struck the glistening tar spot out of sight. Now, said Queequeg, quietly hauling in the line, suppose him whaley eye. Why, dad whale dead. Quick, Bildad, said Peleg, his partner, who aghast at the vicinity to find how treated. Quick essay, you Bildad, and get the ship's papers. We must have Hedgehog there, Quahog, in one of our boats. Look ye, Quahog, we'll give you the 90th lay, and that's more than ever was given a harpooner yet out of Nantucket. So down we went into the cabin, and to my great joy, Queequeg was soon enrolled among the sailing ship's company to which I myself belonged. When all preliminaries were over and Pequod had got everything ready for signing, he turned to me and said, I guess, Quahog, there don't know how to write, does he? I say, Quahog, blast ye, dost thou sign thy name or make thy mark? But at this question, Queequeg, who had twice or thrice before taken part in similar ceremonies, looked no ways abashed, but taking the offered pen, copied upon the paper in the proper place an exact counterpart of a queer round figure which was tattooed upon his arm, so that through Captain Peleg's obstinate mistake touching his appellative, it stood something like this: Quahog, his expert. Meanwhile, Captain Bildad sat earnestly and steadfastly eyeing Queequeg, and at last rising solemnly and fumbling through the pockets of his broad-skirted drab coat, took out a book, and selecting one entitled The Latter Day Coming, for no time to lose, placed it in Queequeg's hands, and then, grasping them and the book with both his, looked earnestly into his eyes, and said, Son of darkness, I must do my duty by thee. I am part owner of this ship, and feel concerned for the souls of all its crew. If thou still clingest to thy pagan ways, which I sadly fear, I beseech thee, remain not for aye a Belial bondsman. Spurn the idol Bel and the hideous dragon. Turn from the wrath to come. Mind thine eye, I say. Oh, goodness gracious. Steer clear of the fiery pit. Something of the salt sea yet lingered in old Bildad's ring, heterogeneously mixed with scriptural and domestic phrases. Avast there, Bildad. Avast now spoiling our harpooner, cried Peleg. Pious harpooneers never make good voyagers. It takes the shark out of them. No harpooner is worth a straw who isn't pretty sharkish. There was young Nat Swain, once the bravest boat header out of all Nantucket and the Vineyard. He joined the meeting and never came to good. He got so frightened about his plaguey soul that he shrinked and sheered away from whales for fear of afterclaps, in case he got stove and went to Davy Jones. Peleg, said Bildad, lifting his eyes, and thou thyself, as I myself, hast seen many a perilous time. Thou knowest, Peleg, what it is to have the fear of death. How then canst thou prate in this ungodly guise? Thou believes thine own heart, Peleg. Tell me, when this same Pequod here had her 3 masts overboard in that typhoon on Japan, that same voyage when thou went mate with Captain Ahab, and did thou not think of death and the judgment then? Hear him now, cried Peleg, marching across the cabin and thrusting his hands far down into his pockets. Hear him, all of ye. Think of that, when every moment we thought the ship would sink. Death and the judgment then. What? With all 3 masts making such an everlasting thundered against the side, and every sea breaking over us, fore and aft. Think of death and the judgment then? No time to think about death then. Life was what Captain Ahab and I was thinking.
And how to save all hands, how to rig jury masts, how to get into the nearest port.
That was what I was thinking of. Bildad said no more, but buttoning up his coat, stalked on deck, where we followed him. There he stood, very quietly, overlooking some sailmakers who were mending a topsail. Now and then he stooped to pick up a patch, or save an end, of tarred twine, which otherwise might have been wasted. Chapter 19. Shipmates, have you shipped in that ship? Queequeg and I had just left the Pequod, and were sauntering away from the water, for the moment each occupied with his own thoughts. when the above words were put to us by a stranger pausing before us, leveled his massive forefinger at the vessel in question. He was but shabbily apparelled in faded jacket and patched trousers, a rag of a black handkerchief investing his neck. A confluent smallpox had in all directions flowed over his face and left it like the complicated ribbed bed of a torrent when the rushing waters have been dried up. Have you shipped in her? He repeated. You mean the ship Pequod, I suppose, said I, trying to gain a little more time for an uninterrupted look at him, rapidly shoving it straight out from him with the fixed bayonet of his pointed finger darted full at the object. Yes, said I. We have just signed. Anything down there about your soul, so? About what? Perhaps you haven't got any, he said quickly. No matter though, I know many chaps that haven't got any. Good luck to them. And they are all the better off for it. A soul's a sort of a fifth wheel to a wagon. What are you jabbering about, shipmate? Said I. He's got enough, though, to make up for all deficiencies of that sort in other chaps. Abruptly said the stranger, placing a nervous emphasis upon the word. Pequod, said I. Let's go. This fellow has broken loose from somewhere. He's talking about something, and somebody we don't know. Stop, cried the stranger. Ye said, true. Ye haven't seen Old Thunder yet, have ye? Who's Old Thunder? Said I, again riveted with the insane earnestness of his. Captain Ahab. What? The captain of our ship, the Pequod. Aye, among some of us old sailor chaps, he goes by that name. You haven't seen him yet, have you? No, we haven't. He's sick, they say, but is getting better, and will be all right again before long. All right again before long, laughed the stranger with a solemnly derisive sort of laugh. Look ye, when Captain Ahab is all right, then this left arm of mine will be all right. Not before. What do you know about him? What did they tell you about him? Say that. They didn't tell much of anything about him. Only I've heard that he's a good whale hunter and a good captain to his crew. That's true. That's true. Yes, both true enough. But you must jump when he gives an order. Step and growl. Growl and go. That's the word with Captain Ahab. But nothing about that thing that happened to him off Cape Horn long ago when he lay like dead for 3 days, nights. Nothing about that deadly scrimmage with the Spaniard afore the altar in Santa. Heard nothing about that, eh? Nothing about the silver calabash he spat into, and nothing about his losing his leg last voyage, according to the prophecy. Didn't ye hear a word about them, matters, and something more? No, I don't think he did. How could ye? Who knows it? Not all Nantucket, I guess. But however mayhap, you've heard tell about the leg, and how he lost it. Aye, ye have heard of that, I dare say. Oh, yes, that. Everyone knows almost. I mean, they know he's only one leg, and that a permaketti took the other off. My friend said, what all this gibberish of yours is about. I don't know, and I don't much care. For it seems to me that you must be a little damaged in the head. But if you're speaking of Captain Ahab of that ship there, the Pequod, then let me tell you that I know all about the loss of his leg. All about it. Sure you do? Pretty sure. With finger pointed and eye leveled at the Pequod, the beggar-like stranger stood a moment as if in a troubled reverie. Then starting a little, turned and said, You shipped, have ya? Names down on the papers. Well, what's signed is signed. And what's to be, will be. And then again, perhaps it won't be after all. Anyhow, it's all fixed and arranged already. And some sailors or other must go with him, I suppose. As well as these all of one men, God insolved, by pitting them. Morning to ye shipmates. Morning, the ineffable heavens, bless ye. I'm sorry I stopped ye. Look here, friend, said I. If you have anything important to tell us, out with it. But if you're only trying to bamboozle us, you're mistaken in your game. That's all I have to say. And it said very well, and I like to hear a chap talk up that way. You are just the man for him, the likes of ye. Morning to ye, shipmates, morning. Oh, when ye get there, tell them I've concluded not to make one of them. My dear fellow, you can't fool us that way. You can't fool us. It is the easiest thing in the world for a man to look as if he had a great secret in him. Morning to ye, shipmates, morning. Morning it is, said I. Come along, Pequod. Let's leave this crazy man. But stop. Tell me your name, will you? Elijah. Elijah. I thought and we walked away, both comment after each other's fashion upon this ragged old sailor, and agreed that he was nothing but a humbug, trying to be a bugbear. But we had not gone, perhaps, above 100 yards, when chancing to turn a corner, and looking back as I did so, who should be seen but Elijah following us, though at a distance. Somehow, the sight of him struck me so, that I said nothing to Pequod of his being behind, but passed on with my comrade, anxious to see whether the stranger would turn the same corner. He did, and then it seemed to me that he was dogging us, but with what intent I could not, for the life of me. The circumstance, coupled with his ambiguous, half-hinting, half-revealing, shrouded sort of talk, now beget in me all kinds of vague wonderments and half-apprehensions, and all connected with the Pequod, and Captain Ahab, and the leg he had lost, and the Cape Horn fit, and the silver calabash, and what Captain Peleg had said of him when I left the ship the day preview, and the prediction of the squall Tistage, and the voyage we had bound ourselves to sail, and 100 other shadowy things. I was resolved to satisfy myself whether this ragged Elijah was really dogging us or not, and with that intent crossed the way with Pequod, and on that side of it retraced our steps. But Elijah passed on without seeming to notice us. This relieved me, and once more, and finally, as it seemed to me, I pronounced him in my heart a humbug. Chapter 20. A day or two passed, and there was great activity aboard the Pequod. Not only were the old sails being mended, but new sails were coming on board, and bolts of canvas and coils of rigging. In short, everything betokened that the ship's preparations were hurrying to a close. Captain Peleg seldom or never went ashore, but sat wigwam, keeping a sharp lookout upon the haven. Bildad did all the purchasing and providing at the stores, and the men employed in the hold and on the rigging were working till long after nightfall. On the day following Pequod's signing the articles, word was given that all the ship's company were stopping, but their chests must be open, for there was no telling how soon the vessel might be sailing. So Pequod and I got down our traps, resolving, however, to sleep ashore to the last. But it seems they always give very long notice in these cases, and the ship did not sail for several days. But no wonder. There was a good deal to be done, and there's no telling how many things to be thought of before the Pequod was fully equipped. Everyone knows what a multitude of things. Beds, saucepans, knives, and forks, shovels and tongs, napkins, nutcrackers, and what not are indispensable to the business of housekeeping. Just so with whaling, which necessitates a 3 years housekeeping upon the wide ocean, far from all grocers, costermongers, doctors, bakers, and bankers. And though this also holds true of merchant vessels, yet not by any means to the same extent as with whalemen. For besides the great length of the whaling voyage, the numerous articles peculiar to the prosecution of the fishery, and the impossibility of replacing them at the remote harbors usually frequented, it must be remembered that of all ships, whaling vessels are the most exposed to accidents of all kinds, and especially to the destruction and loss of the very things upon which the success of the voyage most depends. Hence the spare boats, spare spars, and spare lines, and harpoons, and spare everything but a spare captain and duplicate ship. At the period of our arrival at the island, the heaviest storage of the Pequod had been almost completed, comprising her beef, bread, water, fuel, and iron hoops and stays. But, as the fore hinted, for some time there was a fetching and carrying on board of divers odds and both large and small. Chief among those who did this, fetching and carrying, was Captain Bildad's sister, the lean old lady of a most determined and indefatigable spirit, but withal very kind-hearted, who seemed resolved that, if she could help it, nothing should be found wanting in Pequod. After once fairly getting to sea, at one time she would come on board with a jar of pick for the steward, another time with a bunch of quills for the chief mate's desk, where he kept his log, a third time with a roll of flannel for the small of someone's rheumatic back. Never did any woman better deserve her name, which was Charity, Aunt Charity, as everybody called her. And like a sister of Charity, did this charitable Aunt Charity bustle about hither and thither, ready to turn her hand and heart to anything that promised to yield safety, comfort, and consolation to all on board a ship in which her beloved brother Bildad was, and in which she herself owned a score or two of well-saved dollars. But it was startling to see this excellent-hearted Quakeress coming on board, as she did the last day, with a long oil ladle in one hand and a still longer whaling lance in the other. Nor was Bildad himself, nor Captain Peleg at all backward. As for Bildad, he carried about with him a long list of the articles needed, and at every fresh arrival, down went his mark opposite that. Every once in a while, Peleg came hobbling up, roaring up to the riggers, and then concluded by roaring back. During these days of preparation, Pequod and I often visited the craft, and as often I asked about Captain Ahab, and how he was, and when he was going to come on board his ship. To these questions, they would answer that he was getting better and better, and was expected aboard every day. Meantime, the two captains, Peleg and Bildad, could attend to everything necessary to fit the vessel for the voyage. If I had been downright honest with myself, I would have seen firmly in my heart that I but half fancied made to so long a voyage, without once laying my eyes on the man who was to be the absolute dictator of it, so soon as the ship sailed out upon the open sea. But when a man suspects any wrong, it sometimes happens that if he be already involved in the matter, he insensibly strives to cover up his suspicions, even from himself. And much this way it was with me. I said nothing, and tried to think nothing. At last it was given out that sometime next day the ship would certainly sail. So next morning, Pequod and I took a very early start.